After endless fake ghost TV shows, here at last is a documentary that presents the real evidence.
Manu, are you there? Emily?
Yes.
Yes. Hello, Manu.
The experiments featured in this programme have been described by the scientists who witnessed them as some of the best evidence for life after death ever.
We had 1,000 hours of continuous communication with the spirit world. Be quiet, be quiet, be quiet. Marie.
For 5 years, the Scole Experiment continued to produce a vast range of extraordinary phenomena. More than in any other experiment in the history of the paranormal. It was witnessed by hundreds of visitors and monitored by a team of internationally renowned scientists and investigators.
I must stress, it changes your paradigm.
What they claim to have seen and recorded is so shocking that many will find it unbelievable.
The table levitated and began to spin very rapidly.
I'm not at all convinced that there is such a thing as life after death.
In the US, we put psychic Alison Dubois, the inspiration behind the hit TV show Medium, to the test. Could she communicate with one of the leading Scole researchers after his tragic death?
Is there a doctor in the house?
And we meet this woman.
I'll just never be this age again.
She says she can pick up the voice of her dead son on this simple tape recorder. We also followed the Scole Group to Italy, where they conducted seances with Marcello Bacci, one of the world's most unusual mediums. For decades, grieving parents say they can talk to their dead children via his radio. Although the experiments featured in this program provide scientific evidence for the possibility of life after death, most of the public know nothing about them. This is the first time both the Scole Group and Bacci have allowed their work to be shown together in a TV documentary.
There has, in my view, never been anything like that at all, ever.
In the mid-1990s, in the tiny English village of Scole, one of the most remarkable experiments ever attempted in communication with the dead took place in the cellar of this house. The Scole Experimental Group who conducted these experiments consisted of Diana and Alan Bennett, two of Britain's most accomplished mediums, as well as organisers and investigators Robin and Sandra Foy.
Hi, hello there.
Nice to see you.
For 5 years, twice a week, the group would meet in this tiny cellar. Here the Bennetts would go into trance, allowing what they say were the voices of the dead to speak through them.
Yes, we hear.
Somebody talking.
Hello. Come on, friend.
Come on, friend.
We can hear you starting.
But the Scole Group went far beyond this, achieving spectacular results in a claimed form of spirit communication known as physical mediumship.
There's a wide range of phenomena that physical mediumship over the centuries has been supposedly able to produce. Objects levitating, chairs, tables, objects in the room. Apports and teleportation, in other words, things just dropping out of nowhere. Sometimes things disappearing and reappearing. Apparent spirit hands, apparent spirit forms. Things that people can see happening. There's an effect on real objective things based on, supposedly, the communication or contact between a medium and the spirit world. The spirits are using the medium as a conduit to cause these events to happen.
Physical mediumship is entirely different from mental mediumship because everybody that's present at the time can witness what's happening. Such as if a voice comes from mid-air, everybody can hear and converse with the voice.
Very nice of you to have us here.
If a spirit person manifests, everybody can see what happens.
I think it's fair to say that when you have sittings with physical groups as successful as the Scole Group, you see miracles. You see things which cannot be explained under normal laws of science.
Trying to communicate with the dead has been a lifelong passion for Robin and Sandra Foy. Today, they are among the world's leading experts in physical mediumship.
What happened here during the Scole Experiment was very successful and a dramatic effort which proved conclusively to us that life goes on after we all die.
Diana and Alan Bennett have also participated in physical mediumship for decades. They joined the Scole Experiment in 1993. But both claim their astonishing abilities began long before this.
My first discovery of being a medium was when I was a child. I used to see spirit. I used to hear things and be aware of things that other people weren't aware.
When I was young, I saw spirits. Spirits that would come and show themselves to me.
I think the greatest effort come from the spirit side. I mean, without them you can sit there and nothing will happen.
But a great deal did happen, more in fact than any other mediumship experiment ever conducted. And according to the Scole Group, this success was due to the efforts of a group of deceased personalities on the other side. They called this group the Spirit Team.
A spirit team was a team of spirit personalities who had lived a life on this earth. Several of them had been scientists whilst they were here.
The Scole Group say instructions on how to conduct the experiments were received from the Spirit Team, speaking via the mediums.
If you put your hand into the bowl, please.
Some of the initial experiments involved photography. These began conventionally enough, with the Foys being told to load a film into a camera and place it on the table. But after this, things began to get very strange.
We heard the camera moving round over our heads, and clicking and being wound on by spirit.
In total darkness, so that in reality, nothing should have showed up on the film. But when the film was developed, there were amazing pictures. Wartime pictures of St. Paul's, of a bus that was blown apart in the Blitz. Quite amazing stuff. It was never explained to us exactly why we got these particular pictures, other than the fact that we had a separate photographic spirit team working with us at that stage, who were practicing their art and seeing what they could achieve.
Some films contained images of faces, including human faces, in various stages of formation.
There were a series that appeared to represent bubbles and various other things coming together, partial faces, etc. We were told that what we were seeing were areas of communication within the spirit world.
The Scole Group believed these faces were images of deceased people, which were somehow projected from the other side. To them, this theory was confirmed with the appearance on another Scole film of this blurry profile. Communicators through the mediums informed them that it belonged to a man named Kingsley Fairbridge, who had died in 1924.
We were put in touch in a very obscure way with his daughter, who was happy to agree that that was a picture of her father.
In the next experiments, the Scole Group say they were able to create these images not only in total darkness, but without the use of a camera.
We were asked by the spirit team to put a totally unopened Polaroid 35mm film just in its plastic container. If the spirit team felt that they'd achieved a result, we were asked to develop it.
This could be done immediately in a special processing machine.
You can imagine our surprise when we brought this film up, they'd never been opened, put it through the processor and viewed it, and there was images and faces and writing. How do you explain it was there, you know?
In order to counter accusations that they faked these images, the group invited independent investigators to select the films.
I checked the box, which was factory sealed, identifiable by the glue marks.
He then broke the seal, signed the plastic film container and carried it into the session where it remained on the table. But could it have been switched?
I'm 100% certain that the film I selected was the same film that was returned to me at the end of the session.
The film was immediately processed in front of him.
Halfway along the film, we could see a Latin statement. The Spirit team had said that they'd worked on the film, and lo and behold, there it was.
Do I believe in an afterlife? Yes, I do, completely. I had an experience where I met a medium on the street, and she described my great-grandparents, my grandparents, my great-aunt, who have all passed away, their names, the way that they died, and told me that they were all around me and walking with me and never really have left me or never really leave any of us. So, completely believe in that.
News of the remarkable events at Scole reached Italy, where the Scole Group travelled to meet one of the world's most unusual mediums. Marcello Bacci amazes visitors and scientific investigators who say they can hear the dead speaking through his old vacuum tube radio. This extremely rare form of mediumship is also called direct radio voice, or DRV, and is virtually unknown to the public. With it, experimenters believe that two-way conversations with the dead are possible. But could the Scole Group communicate through Bacci's radio?
Manu, are you there? Emily?
Yes.
Yes. Hello, Manu. Thank you, Manu.
After this, scientist Harry Oldfield, a colleague of the Scole Group, attempts further communication.
We would like to ask the question of the appearance of your space.
I can't really answer that.
Can you tell something about Scole?
Did I appear to be aware of what you're doing in direct contact with them?
Thank you. Will the work progress?
Certainly.
Thank you. This is what I needed to know.
Experts say that Bacci's ability to invite the spirits to speak through his radio is usually so reliable he conducts regular sessions. This seems highly improbable, but these grieving parents don't think so. The walls are littered with pictures of dead loved ones. Parents clearly recognize the voices as belonging to their departed children.
Io sono certa che è mio figlio, così come le altre mamme, perché i ragazzi quando si presentano prima chiamano la mamma, il nome della mamma e poi il loro nome. A parte poi che la voce è quella di mio figlio, l'ho già detto, quindi è inutile che lo ridica.
Da non dimenticare, tuo figlio, spirito è stato
però nel tempo ho avuto delle prove che solo io potevo sapere e che hanno dato la mia, la mia sicurezza di che questa era la prova che mio figlio era ancora vivo.
For the bereaved, it's an experience that rescues them from torment.
La mia vita è la nuova vita, io dico sempre la vita di prima, poi si è fermata quando lui se n'è andato e ricominciata quando l'ho sentito, diversa.
We wish to know more with respect.
Sometimes when communication with us becomes more difficult.
But are these radio voices just a clever hoax? Not according to scientists who have subjected Bacci's mediumship to a battery of tests. One of the leading Italian investigators is Paolo Presi, and his colleagues from Il Laboratorio, an organisation that uses the most stringent methods of science to investigate paranormal claims.
He is a medium. Surely is a medium because all happen when he is present on the experiments.
Using software endorsed by the FBI, Il Laboratorio have conducted voice print analysis. Like a fingerprint, a voice print is unique. It can therefore be used to determine someone's identity with near certainty. They compared voice prints from 2 audio samples. One was the voice of Chiara Lenzi, recorded before she died. The other came out of Bacci's radio after her death and was clearly recognised by her father. The comparison produced a 97% match. Despite this startling evidence, skeptics claim that the voices could be faked by transmitting them from a remote location. But Dr. Emanuele Toriello, who has been investigating Bacci for decades, believes this is impossible. Dr. Toriello was present during key scientific experiments that, he says, eliminated any possibility of remote transmission. One of the first of these experiments involved putting Bacci's radio inside a special device that shields it from all radio signals. Yet still, the voices continued.
I couldn't be more excited.
Second point, the radio was switched off, and though the voices were going through. The third and main point, that the tube or the valves of the radio were totally removed. Still the voice were going through. So you tell me how it's possible.
Thank you for all your hard work.
Do you believe in the possibility of life after death?
No, I believe in a long, long sleep, baby.
Back at Scole, the phenomena were continuing to progress. Nearly all of them took place in this tiny brick cellar, affectionately called the Scole Hole. It was here that the 2 mediums would go into trance, allowing what they say were deceased personalities to take over their bodies.
Hello.
But just how difficult was it to summon the departed?
I think possibly we sat about twice a week for a year before we really got anything significant happen, you know, just minor phenomena up to then.
But the group's determination and patience paid off. By 1995, visitors were reporting that the Scole Hole was alive with extraordinary phenomena. According to the Scole Group, their spirit communicators requested that they place this empty glass dome on their table.
The glass dome was very important to the Scole work. Creative energy stored in the dome and was used by the spirit team to produce the phenomena that happened at Scole.
In this remarkable photograph, the energy can actually be seen radiating out from the dome. But since these phenomena are so unusual, the group knew that without careful independent scrutiny, their experiments would be dismissed as fake. Therefore, the group allowed their experiments to be monitored by a team of scientists and paranormal investigators from the Society for Psychical Research, or SPR, based in London. For over a century, the SPR has specialised in examining paranormal phenomena in an unbiased and scientific way. Among its members have been some of Britain's most accomplished scientists, including a dozen Nobel laureates. Its investigators have exposed many fake mediums. They are not easily fooled. One of the leading researchers into Scole was veteran SPR member Montague Keane.
Initially, we were all pretty sceptical because what had been claimed seemed so way out.
Another key researcher was Dr. Arthur Ellison, an emeritus professor of electrical engineering and a former president of the SPR.
No scientist of any kind would ever say that anything could not possibly happen.
The third principal investigator was research psychologist Dr. David Fontana. Professor Fontana is one of the world's most respected paranormal investigators.
Paranormal is that mysterious area behind the seen and the known world. And since most of the world is unseen and unknown, and most of the world is full of mystery, for me it's a fascinating and absorbing area.
To preclude the possibility of fraud, these scientists were allowed to inspect the cellar and all its contents before and after sessions. All participants had to empty their pockets and leave their belongings outside. The cellar had only one entrance, and this door was kept locked during all sessions. Despite these precautions, the incredible events at Scole continued unabated, and the SPR investigators reported what they saw in graphic terms.
We saw coloured lights, we saw materialisations, we had direct voices, that is, spirit voices talking from the air. We were touched by the spirits. We saw a whole range of phenomena which could not be mistaken by three investigators such as ourselves.
In the spirit of openness, the Scole Group allowed more investigators to scrutinise their sessions. These included leading scientists from several disciplines, even a professional magician. One of the scientists was the internationally renowned biologist and author, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake.
Science has done very little to investigate the afterlife or reincarnation. Most materialists assume that both of them are impossible. So there's a kind of dogmatic denial by some scientists of the possibility of these things. But I wouldn't say that was a scientific understanding. I would say that was a dogmatic, ideologically motivated dismissal. The only way to have a scientific understanding is to do the research.
We had a number of different professors of different disciplines to come, and sometimes they could test their expertise against the expertise on the other side. For example, Professor Archie Roy, who's an astronomer and specialises in the movement of celestial bodies, had a discussion with the other side about celestial mechanics. And he said afterwards that he thought there were only about half a dozen people in the country who would know exactly what they were talking about.
Such evidence is gold dust to researchers, as it is unlikely to have been fabricated by the mediums who possess no academic training in this area. Although the scientists found this sort of evidence impressive, they still needed to eliminate any possibility of fraud taking place under the cover of darkness. Therefore, the Scole Group devised several controls to help eliminate this possibility. One of these controls involved all participants wearing luminous wristbands. These bands were attached with Velcro, so they could not be removed without attracting attention. They also requested the use of night vision equipment.
We persistently asked them to accept infrared cameras, and they said not yet. It would interfere with the energy in some way. So we had to accept this with great reluctance.
We were told that this phenomena could be developed in the light, but if it were, it would take an awfully long time to produce, years and years, rather than a few months that it actually took us.
Critics saw this insistence on darkness as an excuse to hide fraud, but participants to the Scole experiment were not always in total darkness.
Oh, look at you!
There were various shapes, generally like a pea-sized light, and it had substance. They would come and sit on your hand, you could feel them.
They were intelligently directed and intelligently moving, and would be responsive to our wishes, whether expressed or silent.
The gyrations were sometimes so rapid that it almost left like a circle of light going over here and over there. Sometimes two lights would appear and just stare at me within inches of my eyes.
I thought at first that the lights must be small light-emitting diodes suspended on the end of nylon fishing line.
Then suddenly a light would start to do a tap dance on the table, bouncing up and down on the table, and you could hear it click as it rebounded from the table, and suddenly it
went pop, went through the table and came out the other side. Now, no nylon fishing line explanation would account for it going through an apparently solid, well, it was a solid object, a table.
The lights also had another rather strange trick up their sleeve, if I may talk about lights as having sleeves, and that was to pass through bodies.
I was actually used as a guinea pig in the early days to see how it felt and to develop the phenomena. And this light would actually enter through my chest, and then 3 minutes later it would probably pop out of the arm or something and disappear across the room. This was being developed to produce a healing phenomena.
I have this bad knee, and at one point we had a light that was moving around the room and rested on my knee for a minute and suddenly moved inside my knee.
Yeah, she just went into my bad knee.
I could feel it moving around on my knee and then all of a sudden shot out the back of my leg and took off. The pain was greatly reduced and the swelling that had been in it that day was gone, and that was a huge, wonderful thing to happen.
Visitors declared themselves delighted by these displays, but they were astonished to hear voices of what they say were spirit personalities talking through the mediums.
We had 1,000 hours of communication during the Scole Experiment. 1,000 hours of continuous communication with the spirit world.
Be quiet, be quiet, be quiet. Shh.
Emily, when did you live on the Earth?
Oh, a long time ago now.
19th century?
Yes.
In this dramatic form of spirit communication, the mediums go into trance, during which time, they say, spirits take over their bodies and speak through them.
It's the love that connects people.
Right.
And the rest doesn't matter a jot.
So what's it like to supposedly talk to the dead in this way?
It becomes very natural, and actually talking to somebody who is deceased, if you like, is a natural thing, purely and simply because it's the same as you talking to me here in this room at this very moment. There's no difference other than the fact that we are aware that they're no longer in this world.
And not be frightened in any way.
But could the mediums have just been acting? The researchers didn't think so.
The voices were quite different from those of the mediums themselves, and the personalities behind the voices were not only quite different, but were very consistent. Even the accents were.
But it wasn't just the consistency of the accents that impressed the researchers. They reported that the personalities also remembered every detail of all conversations spoken to visitors over a 5-year period. Add to those skills the ability to read minds. This apparently occurred when a female spirit spoke to the group.
She would tell us what was going to happen, she would comment on what we were doing, and sometimes what we were thinking. She would answer our questions quite frequently before we'd actually asked them, which was quite embarrassing sometimes.
Thank you for your warm appreciation of what we're trying to do.
This communicator identified herself as the spirit of a Mrs. Emily Bradshaw.
And Mrs. Bradshaw, who was a very commanding figure, a lady of the upper class Victorian or Edwardian lady, or she sounded like that.
We continue from our side of life to influence people still in the body.
But what evidence was there that these voices were really from the deceased?
We knew that we were communicating with deceased personalities because a number of people who communicated with us were able to be identified by independent witnesses at the time who could testify as to them being people they knew, evidence which couldn't possibly have been known by anybody else.
But what's it like for the mediums to have these ethereal communicators speak through them?
Those sensations become more and more intense and build up to a point where I feel the personality actually taking part of my senses over. I become more and more unaware of my own body and also more and more unaware of my own thoughts.
My mother died about 1.5 years before my father did, and 3 days before my father died, he saw a vision of my mother and was very disturbed when she suddenly disappeared. And I believe that his death coincided with that vision of her and wanting to see her again.
Back at Scole, visitors reported seeing and especially hearing these objects materialize from out of nowhere. In the language of physical mediumship, these objects are called apports.
An apport is an object which is quite solid, which is brought from one location to another during an experimental session, but in so doing apparently passes through solid walls, doors, etc. Well, the total number of apports that we had during the experimental sessions was about 80 or even more.
Whilst we were sitting here, this object would arrive, just materialise, and arrive on the table. But as it arrived, that's the sort of noise it would make.
Despite the fact that witnesses heard a loud bang every time an apport arrived, no matter how small, skeptics have dismissed this phenomenon as objects merely thrown into the air. But the appearance of these apports are not so easy to explain away. These newspapers arrived in pristine condition, despite having originated in the 1940s. But who might have sent it to the Scole Group, and why? The answer arrived, they say, when dead British medium Helen Duncan spoke to them via one of the mediums. During World War II, Duncan's life was ruined when she was arrested and imprisoned for practicing mediumship. As she described her ordeal to the group, this newspaper allegedly appeared out of nowhere. To their astonishment, displayed prominently on its front page was the story of Duncan's trial and conviction.
I think she suffered greatly through her mediumship, and she was really coming to wish us well, and she bought the newspaper as a sign of a very turbulent time in her life.
The scientists knew that an old newspaper could easily be copied and printed onto modern paper, so Montague Keane had the suspect newspaper analysed.
We took it to the leading research station in England, indeed in the world, on paper and printing, and it was absolutely clear from their report that first of all it was done on letterpress, which has gone out of existence virtually since the early 1970s, I would say. It was newsprint produced during wartime, which lacked certain chemicals which you couldn't get hold of. So this was a genuine article which appeared 50 years after the event, but no one has been able to explain how it got there.
So where did all these apported objects come from?
We were told by the spirit team that they were never stolen, but were basically objects that had been lost or discarded, or at one time been owned by the spirit personality that brought them for us.
Back in Italy, we were given unique access to film one of Bacci's private seances.
But Tim, now you have to sit somewhere and sit. Not in my back. Not in my back. Somewhere that you can, yes.
Despite the loss of this camera, we were allowed to continue using this night shot camera to record the seance, which took place in total darkness. As the seance progressed, the medium went into trance. We were hoping to capture what visitors to Scole said they had witnessed, the levitation of solid objects. However, minutes later, we were asked to switch off the night shot camera. But secretly, we kept it running. And what we captured was truly astonishing. This heavy oak table rose into the air. But levitations were not the only phenomena we witnessed during these seances. Like the Scole Experiment, visitors to Baci's centre say they have received apported objects. This woman is one of them.
Questo è un apporto che ho ricevuto al centro Baci. Al centro Baci succedono spesso queste cose ed è incredibile. Uno potrebbe dire, le hanno messi là, se lo sono inventati, ma non è così, perché chi l'ha vissuto sa che questo è vero.
Once again, we were permitted to use night shot cameras in the hope of capturing the arrival of an apport. We were not disappointed. With the medium in trance, the camera crew were astonished when, out of nowhere, they felt these flowers falling on them.
Che sta succedendo? Io non sto capendo nulla di Che sta succedendo? Io non sto capendo nulla di
With the lights on, people reacted in amazement at just how many flowers had appeared.
This one is gone in his hand.
Sì, così.
Così, proprio in mano.
Così.
As they collected them, we continued our filming.
You see, it has been ripped. It has been ripped. See, it is fresh.
Although we saw no signs of trickery, this séance was not conducted under controlled conditions. Therefore, critics could claim it was possible for someone to have thrown the flowers into the room. But apports which have a specific connection to departed loved ones frequently appear at the centre. Connections that Baci has no previous knowledge of.
Sempre la prima sera mi è arrivato un apporto, una foglia di giada di questa grandezza, identica alla foglia che mio figlio aveva sulla tuta della foto che io ho portato quella sera per far conoscere mio figlio, ma che nessuno ancora aveva mai visto. Identica.
This woman said that a single red rose was apported into her hand. She was also convinced it came from her dead son, because every week, she told us, she placed an identical flower on his grave. As impossible as it sounds, could this rose really have been sent from the other side?
I'm not sure that I do believe in the afterlife. I think it's because I'd like to have final rest when I die rather than have to think about coming back as something else.
Back at Scole, the phenomena were continuing to progress. The scientists were about to experience something even more shocking.
Another thing that happened was that a hand materialised and sort of glowed. And there was this disembodied hand floating around. When I told some of my friends about it, they said it sounded just like the Addams Family. And I commented to the medium, I said, oh, I can see a disembodied hand. And she said, it's not disembodied. This was Mrs. Bradshaw, who was speaking through one of the mediums. And I said, you mean there's an invisible body attached? And she said, precisely. And then she said, would you like it to touch you? And I said, yes. So she said, well, ask it. So I said, hand, will you touch me? And so the hand went round behind me and it tapped me on the shoulder.
But could these hands have been hoaxed? This visitor who felt the truncated length of a disembodied arm didn't think so.
And I was so startled, I moved my hand and it traveled right up a sleeve. There was a sleeve, like a cotton sleeve, very much like this, right up to the shoulder, and then it just stopped. There was nothing beyond where the shoulder would have been. It was a really amazing experience.
See the hand? Oh, yes, yes, oh, yes. You see the hand? Yes, the hand. It's stretched to the finger. Oh, I see, yes.
Sometimes we would be touched by these hands. Sometimes we would invite them to touch us. Sometimes they would touch us on our knees, let's say, or on our feet, which, as it was a fraud-proof table, were inaccessible to the mediums themselves.
So what's it like to touch one of these spirit hands?
It felt cool, but not cold. It didn't feel clammy, it didn't feel slimy, it felt like a normal human hand, and it grasped my hand firmly.
The unseen communicators told the scientists that they usually materialized a hand or an arm because it was easier than materializing a full body. But some cases of full bodies being materialized were reported.
I had the presence, the physical presence, of my mother, my father and my sister, all in solid form, standing in front of me, all of whom I was able to hold, to embrace, carry out conversations with them. I've witnessed it so many times, it just becomes a normal thing.
Normal is a word strained by the experiences of the Scole Experiment. And there was nothing normal when patches of light floated over the scientists' heads and slowly changed into spectral forms.
The diffuse patches of light would take the form just of a human face, moving round the room with the direct voice very, very faintly coming from the diffused patch of light, and the lips moving again very faintly.
As I stared at the face, it was noticeably smaller than a normal size head. But within the face itself, features were clearly visible. We could see the glistening of the eyes, we could see the eyes moving.
And even more remarkable forms were to appear.
They looked like angelic forms.
It's over my hands.
Oh my goodness, look at that!
And I was very fortunate that one came and landed on my hand. And just the energy that you felt from it when it connected with you was a lovely experience, and it just felt like an overwhelming feeling of love.
These are great experiences, you see. Again, I must stress, it changes your paradigm. You go in thinking none of this can be true, but after experience after experience after experience, it gradually dawns on you, hey, there's something going on here that we can't explain by normal scientific laws, but which nevertheless exists.
Years ago, I was staying in this very old inn, and I actually saw somebody come out from a wall and walk through and just disappear again. And I just believe there are people that are trapped between here and the next world.
The experiments featured in this program have been described by the scientists who witnessed them as some of the best evidence for life after death ever. After 2 years of intense effort, the Scole Experiment began to produce more phenomena than in any mediumship experiment in the history of the paranormal.
Their initial claims were that they were in contact with a group of deceased entities who were producing, with their help, a number of pictures of either deceased persons or strips of films, which they claimed to be produced without any cameras and in the dark.
To eliminate any possibility of hoaxing, the scientists brought their own film and locked it in a specially designed security box.
The box was held in the hands of the investigators so that no one could get at it. And then immediately afterwards, we would take it out of the box ourselves so that no one else touched it, and then develop it ourselves in a special machine.
Despite all these precautions, the experiments continued to produce the incredible images seen here.
They were able to achieve whole lengths of film, sometimes up to as much as 4 feet, with various words, symbols, messages, all sorts of different things on that film.
Other films contained poems in centuries-old German and fragments of Greek, Chinese, Hebrew, Latin, and even Sanskrit. The Scole Group were ordinary people with no knowledge of these languages. But did these films have a purpose? If dead personalities were producing these images, why did they apparently design some of them as complex puzzles?
Providing something which is a puzzle, which is difficult to solve, is simply because it is difficult to solve. It isn't readily available. It can't be easily attributable to the person sitting around the table.
Despite lengthy investigations, the possible authors of some of the films, like this German poem, proved impossible to trace. But others were easier to track down. This one contains a poem by Frederick Myers. Intriguingly, Myers was one of the founders of the SPR and a passionate researcher into the evidence for life after death. Before he died in 1901, he promised his colleagues at the SPR that he would try to communicate with them from the other side. Could this film actually represent evidence of the afterlife sent by one of its greatest investigators? Mostly the researchers were unclear as to who might have created these films. However, there were clues as to who the ghostly authors might be in the form of initials or signatures. For example, in this film, the signature appears to belong to the dead singer and actor Ivor Novello. This was received on one of the Scole films. Compare it to Novello's actual signature. Investigators say these images were created in total darkness. But how?
I think that those pictures can be explained only by imagining that the spirits can project their recollections and images onto a film in some way we can't begin to understand. The only alternative explanation is they are all fakes, and I don't believe that there's evidence that that is the case.
Although the mechanism for their creation remains a mystery, investigators concluded they were unique.
As far as the photographic evidence is concerned at Scole, the strips of film, there has, in my view, never been anything like that at all, ever.
As far as I'm aware, I don't think there is any scientific evidence for life after death.
Spurred on by the photographic experiments, the Scole Group began a series of video experiments called Project Alice, after Alice through the looking glass. Their ambition was nothing less than to try and capture moving images sent from the spirit world. The Scole Group insists that instructions on how to position the camera and mirrors came from their spirit communicators. They were told to set up a video camera in the dark cellar, aim it at a pair of mirrors so that it could only film its own viewfinder. While it was recording, nothing unusual was seen. But when the tape was played back, these remarkable pictures appeared.
We had images on the video, sometimes of what looked like a tunnel of light. Other times, spirit faces were coming towards us. Sometimes what appeared to be a doorway moving.
Skeptics claim these images were created by video feedback, occurring when a camera records its own output. But scientists have ruled this out. Video feedback doesn't produce this kind of result. As to what these extraordinary pictures represent, we can only guess, since their meaning was never explained to the Scole Group. This video, also totally unexplained, appears to be a ghostly face with moving eyes. Later, a few video experiments were attempted in full light. Again, nothing unusual was seen during the recording. However, on playback, this unworldly figure appeared. But was it possible for the Scole Group to have faked these images? Not according to the investigator who monitored these experiments, Swiss lawyer and businessman Dr. Hans Scher.
There's absolutely absolutely no possibility that this film could have been prepared before, because I selected one of the video films which was in its original packaging, which I opened. I took the film out, I signed the film, and I put it personally in the video camera.
He inserted it into the camera. We never touched at any stage the camera or the film.
When we played the film, it showed at the beginning a number of bubbles of various colors.
But there was one particular bubble on there in which the face of a person appeared, and it was a man with spectacles.
Although Dr. Scher did not recognize this face, the Scole Group thought it might have belonged to someone who was trying to communicate with him from the afterlife.
I have heard of the electronic voice phenomenon. I think it's actually one of the most disturbing and unnerving aspects of the notion of there being an afterlife.
Attempting to capture spirit voices via technical devices like radios and tape recorders has a long tradition that goes back to the last century. Today, there are tens of thousands of people around the world who say they have captured the voices of the dead on simple tape recorders. This is known as the electronic voice phenomena, or EVP, and was recently popularized in the Hollywood blockbuster White Noise. Despite the Hollywood treatment, EVP has been the focus of serious scientific investigation. One of the leading researchers is Alexander McRae, an electronics engineer who has worked on communication systems for the space shuttle. He has been investigating EVP for decades.
If somebody came up to me in the street and said, there's nothing paranormal about EVP, I would say, well, I've done at least 20 years and hundreds of experiments, and I know that it is a paranormal effect. Now, how many experiments have you done?
But skeptics insist that EVP is nothing more than the random pickup of broadcast signals like radio and TV. To test this theory, McRae tried to obtain EVP inside a laboratory that was fully shielded against radio and sound waves. This meant it was impossible to pick up any stray broadcast signals.
So inside the laboratory you couldn't pick up anything, but yet the device still produced voices.
Although this audio sample is hard to understand, the very fact it was recorded defies all known laws of science. One experimenter of EVP is Vicky Talbot, who lost her son Braden in a boating accident in 2001.
Okay, I'm coming down into Wildcat Cove right now, which is the cove that my son departed from and did not return.
Ever since then, she says she can record and recognize his voice using this digital recorder.
Well, that's Braden. What has really convinced me is the way he speaks, the stress, the intonation. Sometimes he sounds exactly as he did in life.
Happy New Year.
He will use certain phrases that we used to use. He will say certain things that will identify himself as the person that he was in life. I am convinced, personally, that I am communicating with my son.
Like visitors to Scole and to Bachi's centre, EVP practitioners find comfort in the belief that they can still communicate with loved ones. But even this conviction can't make up for the unbearable burden of losing a child.
These just make me want to cry, just looking at him. He'll just never be this age again or do that again. What matters is the love that you have for your family. That's what really matters, and not to screw it up, and to remember they can be gone in a flash. You know, these other people, I feel so sorry for them because they have no way of communicating with those that they have lost. And they go around thinking, if only, if only, if only. I don't have to think that. And that's a good thing.
Although EVP provides some comfort to the bereaved, practitioners say that the voices are often unclear, always one way, and frustratingly short.
One way that we also communicated with spirit, and which was a very effective way, was by use of an ordinary, very cheap tape recorder whose amplifiers were used by the spirit team to carry on a two-way conversation with us.
We inspected this machine and found it was completely normal. Earlier, its built-in microphone had been removed to eliminate the possibility of recording anything. When the machine, which contained a blank cassette, was activated, witnesses were astonished when they heard this voice asking them a question.
Scole Experimental Group.
Yes.
Yes, Scole Experimental Group. Experimenting with audio.
Yes.
Historic moment it is.
The Scole Group say that their spirit communicators suggested ways of improving their experiments. For example, they told Professor Ellison, one of the SPR scientists, how to build a device for boosting communications via the tape recorder. But this information arrived in a very strange way. These images appeared after an unexposed film locked in the security box was later processed by the scientists. The scientists speculated about who was providing this technical information. Then initials at the end of the film seemed to have solved this mystery.
I wrote to the Edison Memorial people in America, and they sent me a copy of one of his letters, which contained his initials, which looked almost identical to the signature on this film.
This matching set of initials convinced the researchers it was Thomas Edison providing this information. Not only was Edison the world's most famous inventor, he also had an enormous interest in the possibility of an afterlife. His intention to build a machine that could communicate with the dead made headlines around the world, but he died before being able to build it. Is it possible that through the Scole Group, he finally achieved this aim?
My understanding of life after death is what we've done here, the way we've affected the people about us and things that we do, and it lives on through them.
Spirit voices speaking through the mediums. Spirit communication written on sealed film in locked boxes. All these incredible phenomena. But could the scientists have been tricked?
Skeptics are often unaware of the amount of experience and the amount of knowledge that goes into investigations of this kind. Between the three investigators, you could say we'd had 50 years and more. We know all the tricks.
I don't see how it could be faked. It's impossible.
Nevertheless, was it possible for the Scole Group to have perpetrated a massive hoax?
These things are so extraordinary that when one tells them to people who've not had the experiences themselves, they think, oh, it must be trickery. And the challenge then always is, okay, you duplicate it.
But so far, no one has been able to do this. Nevertheless, critics still claim that the events at Scole were produced by the kinds of conjuring tricks used by stage magicians and entertainers.
You find them
You found them in this manner like this, you see.
Because professional magicians learn all the skills of illusion and misdirection,
Genuine. I'm not going to show you how it's done, because if I showed you how it was done, you'd tell everybody else.
they are also well qualified to detect this type of fraud.
Hey, presto.
With that in mind, James Webster was invited to scrutinise a number of Scole sessions. Webster is a member of the Magic Circle in Britain and has been a professional magician for over 40 years.
Well, I had an opportunity to view the cellar. I could see no magic props or anything which made me feel inclined to think there was any hoaxing or trickery.
But could he replicate the events at Scole?
I could not do it myself as a professional magician, and I don't believe in any magician that I knew could do even the lighting, let alone the other phenomena that I witnessed. Any one of those in the cellar, I'd say they were wasting their time doing this here for nothing, when they could be earning $1 million out there on the stage.
In 1999, after an exhaustive 2-year investigation, the investigators published their conclusions in the SPR's official proceedings. They were looking for evidence of a hoax. They sifted evidence for signs of fakery. But did they find it?
If you take all the phenomena within the whole of the Scole experiment over 2 years while we were there, I would say that the possibility of fraud and faking was nil.
Although the Scole report includes theoretical discussions about how individual phenomena might have been faked, the chief investigators concluded that events at Scole cannot be explained either by known scientific laws or by trickery. But psychology professor Chris French, the co-editor of Skeptic magazine, remains unconvinced.
There's lots of claimed evidence for life after death coming from lots of different sources. The debate should be about the quality of the evidence. At the moment, on the basis of the available evidence, I'm not at all convinced that there is such a thing as life after death.
I think the skeptics regard the possibility of the survival of human consciousness as inherently so impossible that anyone must be rather crazy to believe it. But when you look at the evidence, you have to ask yourself whether you'd be even more crazy not to believe it, or to find some alternative explanation which makes any sort of sense. And I haven't found one.
When we die, we go into another world. A lot of worlds. 3,665 worlds.
How can you be so specific?
Because I read it in the Bible.
News of the amazing events at Scole spread around the world. In 1997, they were invited to hold sessions in 4 European countries and the United States. Some of the most successful sessions occurred in the Los Angeles home of Brian Hurst.
We wanted to see whether it could also take place so many thousands of miles away from Scole, here in Southern California.
Hurst's converted garage was the venue for 8 sessions. As many as 30 people attended each one.
Oh, hi! Hello, Cynthia.
Hi,
nice
how
to
are
see
you?
you. Great.
Before each session, investigators carefully inspected the room.
Many people went in at different times before the sessions, and there was no paraphernalia, there was nothing hidden there at all.
Despite being interviewed a decade after the Scole experiment, these witnesses are still profoundly moved by what they saw.
There was so much phenomena going on. It was really overwhelming.
As with most sessions, visitors began by sitting quietly in total darkness. Then they started hearing the voices of the spirit team speaking through the mediums.
Be quiet, be quiet, be quiet. Marie.
Then the darkened room burst into life.
Is that cool? Look at that. That is awesome. Wow.
It's like a firefly.
Like fireworks. Wow.
And then it would go up to the rafters of the garage and come down and thunk hard like a big rock hitting the table and then disappear.
Just gone through the table.
As well as these amazing balls of light, furniture in the room began to move.
We had a table in the center of the room that had crystals on it.
It's moving.
The table is indeed levitating.
The table levitated, was turned on its side, and began to spin very rapidly. The crystals never fell off. Even if there hadn't been crystals on the table, it would have been impossible to have turned the table sideways and rotated it with the speed at which it rotated. And we could see this because there were luminescent strips on the table. And it began to spin around actually so rapidly it almost looked like a pinwheel.
As well as familiar spirit communicators, other voices the group say belong to dead relatives also attempted to communicate.
We're several Someone for Shirley.
Yes? Sure, Dad?
Speak to.
Hi, Dad.
I really do feel that my dad came and he was the one who put his hands on my shoulders.
Oh.
The way we were situated in the room, my chair was right up against a wall, and there was no way another person could be behind me.
Then another hand appeared in front of them. But who did it belong to?
There was a particular communicator called Reg Lawrence, who was an engineer in his lifetime and who became very expert at producing voices from midair.
Oh, hello, Reg.
Hello, Brian. Very nice of you to have us here.
He
just touched my hand.
Oh,
yes. Oh, he's stroking it. It's slightly cold, but it's flesh. He's shaking my hand. Oh my God. Oh, Rex, you've made my year.
You made mine.
As usual, Lawrence did not communicate through the mediums. Instead, the group could hear his voice projected from different parts of the room.
Some of the voices were moving around the room, even high up in the rafter area that somebody would have had to climb up on a ladder to get up there, and there's no way that was happening.
The spirit team also came to be regarded as healers by the participants.
Has it gone inside you, that light?
It's in my chest right now. It goes right there around my heart, and I have a little bit of a heart problem.
I was diagnosed with cancer, and a very fast-moving, dangerous cancer. I sat with Scole, and probably 2 to 3 weeks later, I had biopsies again, and they came back completely negative.
All of the visitors attending the LA session said the experience changed their lives forever.
When you walk out of that room, you definitely feel like you've been exposed to something very extraordinary.
We actually saw the spirits. And that's got to be positive evidence for survival.
We do live on after death. They certainly proved that to us that night.
Being survived in Auschwitz, and also my parents were killed in Auschwitz, including my 11-year-old brother, who was killed on arrival with my parents, and I just cannot accept it that that should be the end of them.
Previously, we have shown how experiments at Scole and with Bachi provide powerful evidence for life after death. But some researchers think there may be another possible explanation. Could some of the remarkable events shown in this film be the result of human paranormal abilities like psychokinesis, the claimed ability of the mind to directly affect matter?
There's an enormous amount of evidence for the existence of psychokinesis. In the laboratory, we're talking mainly about the evidence of human consciousness on random number generators and very small events that can be totally controlled. There is clear evidence that people can affect things.
One of the most famous practitioners of psychokinesis, or PK, was a Russian housewife called Nina Kulagina. Kulagina was able to demonstrate her abilities under strictly controlled conditions in front of a team of scientists. Researchers who investigated her were convinced she was able to do this solely by the power of her mind. So could the Scole Group and their visitors unwittingly have created some or all of the phenomena using mind over matter?
As an explanation, although it's not more than just simply a label to it, this is psychokinesis in physical mediumship. Whether it is a spirit working through someone, a spirit acting directly on an object, or the medium's mind causing the things to move.
Say there were real mind over matter effects going on as opposed to conjuring tricks, then how do we know they were coming from the minds of the disembodied people rather than from the minds of the mediums who were sitting in the room?
There is no definitive answer to this question. But the theory that these phenomena were due solely to psychokinesis from the living seems improbable, since PK produced in laboratories tends to be weak. Therefore, mind over matter from the living is unlikely to explain the huge range of phenomena featured in this film.
Emily, when did you live on the Earth?
Oh, a long time ago now.
19th century?
Yes.
We simply have a number of clues of information which was extremely unlikely to have derived from the subconscious mind or the conscious mind of the medium. And the more impressive those are, the less likely it is that you can say that this is an aspect of mediumship. And the more likely it is, it's an aspect of discarnate communication.
Previously, we travelled with the Scole Group to Italy, where they first met with Marcello Bacci. They say they were able to talk to the spirits via his radio.
Come on, who's this? Come on, I'm here. Time stream.
But when the Scole Group visited Bacci in a later session, he was having problems. For months, hundreds of people who came from around the world in the hope of hearing their dead loved ones were bitterly disappointed. All they heard was static. Bacci was depressed. He feared he had lost his unique talent. Then, in an extraordinary piece of luck, as our cameras rolled in an interview with Bacci, the radio, which had been silent for so long, burst into life.
Chiudete tutto! Scusa, they're coming the radio. They're coming the radio.
Grazie Gregorio, però ci sono, vi prego, stasera sapete.
Bacci's drought was over. When the radio voice stopped, there was celebration.
Mamma mia, mamma mia che gli hanno detto.
Bacci felt he'd regained his ability to communicate with the spirits. But then joy turned to disappointment as he thought he had failed to record the voice.
Madonna, non è partito.
No.
Era solo il tuo.
No, era partito, l'ho spento io, vai. L'ho già messo indietro.
Ah, te?
Ma mi fa sì.
Poveretto, lo desiderato. Io poi dico, ma
l'ho messo io indietro.
Once the recording was transcribed, Bacci told us the voice belonged to a spirit called Gregorio, a Catholic friar who had died many years ago. Later, independent researcher Dr. Toriello read the last part of this ghostly message.
Man, he passed his time just deceiving himself, okay? But when all of you will be here, where we are, okay? Then you will find the answer to all your questions. I'm sorry, I cannot say more.
We do look down on our
friends and loved ones after we die, until such time as we move on to some other dimension. I think you can think what you like, really.
Despite the evidence from Scole and Bacci, most scientists still refuse to even consider the possibility that consciousness might survive death. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, the internationally renowned biologist and Scole investigator, offers an explanation.
There's a dominant materialism in science that grew up in the 19th century. It's become part of the culture of science, but it's really a dogmatic belief system rather than a testable theory.
What this means is that scientists have become completely focused on the things they can both measure and replicate in labs.
Within science, based on a materialist point of view, the mind is the brain. So anything that suggests the mind might be more than the brain goes against the theory, and therefore most scientists don't want to know about it.
Another prominent scientist not convinced that consciousness is solely the result of brain activity is Dr. Charles Tart.
But that's just a small part of the spectrum.
Dr. Tart is Emeritus Professor of Psychology at the University of California and a leading researcher into the evidence for life after death.
The idea that survival of bodily death is impossible and that we're nothing but our brains and bodies is really a function of an outmoded view in science, a Newtonian worldview. Now, the Newtonian worldview works very well for everyday events, but one of the most interesting things about modern science, especially when you look at stuff like quantum theory, is that the world is far more mysterious than we think. And we now have experimental evidence of what Einstein called spooky action at a distance, that we can instantaneously affect something in a distant part of the universe. That's really wild. If consciousness has any of the qualities of this quantum level of existence, then phenomena like survival of bodily death are probably not so mysterious after all.
But could quantum theory explain one of the most shocking experiments conducted at Scole?
This particular experiment was perhaps the most important experiment of the whole series.
Previously, we showed how visitors reported seeing these balls of light appear before them.
It's like fireworks!
On this occasion, one of them flew inside a large quartz crystal.
The crystal then levitated. We could see it glowing, and then descended into a Pyrex bowl. Then Arthur Ellison was invited to pick it up. He picked it up and satisfied himself that it was there and it was glowing, and he put it down again. He was asked right away to pick it up again. He tried to, and his fingers closed right over it. It had dematerialized.
There's nothing there, yes, it looks the same, but there's nothing there.
Then he was asked to pick it up again, and it rematerialized in his hand.
Oh, I can feel the crystal now.
Now this dumbfounded him. This is what finally convinced him that this was real, because it couldn't have been faked in any way. And he had his head right over the top of the bowl in order to ensure that no hand or no instrument could interfere with it.
Of course, we were totally amazed by this. Things do not materialize and dematerialize. This is against all the laws of nature. We're trained scientists, of course. We know how the world behaves, and it doesn't behave like that.
When you really think what we're experiencing now, that's amazing. Miracle, yes.
But what does this remarkable demonstration tell us about what might happen after death?
The spirit team told us that the experiment with the crystal in the bowl gave a good example of what happened when we die, in that the essence of the crystal remained even when the physical part of the crystal had been removed. Our bodies represent the physical part, but the essence of ourselves remains the same. This, if you like, can be termed the soul.
believe in the possibility of life after death. What do I think would happen after? I don't know. I just don't know, do you?
Well, I don't particularly want to have anything other than pure death, and I would rather not believe in survival, but I find it impossible to be intellectually honest and not believe in survival.
Tragically, during the production of this film, Montague Keen died. But this gave us the opportunity of testing whether or not he actually got his wish for oblivion. This came in the form of Alison Dubois. Dubois has become one of the most famous mediums in the world after her abilities were dramatized in the hit TV show Medium.
That's huge. When things come through that strong,
Huge.
I can't get out.
We visited the University of Arizona, where scientists were testing the abilities of America's top mediums. Here we challenged Alison Dubois to contact the spirit of Montague Keen.
It's not the same as when you're alive.
She was able to conduct her mediumship in full light, in front of the camera, with two researchers seated behind, asking questions.
Do you have any idea who this person is?
Dubois wasn't given any information about Keen. The only thing she was told was the first name of Keen's widow, Veronica.
The fact that he gets to still be here around the people he loves is huge to him.
Although many of Dubois' statements were vague, some were astonishingly accurate.
He went down at a podium, or no. He's showing a man falling at the podium, like, and falls, and he goes down at the podium.
Okay.
This is important. It's like an assembly.
On the night of his death, Keen was taking part in a debate at the Royal Society of Arts in London. While defending his position, his voice faltered mid-sentence, and he died.
These things are just years.
Take a rest.
No, I don't even know what it means. I mean, he's making me feel like either he had a heart attack or his breath was taken from him, but he's showing him knees buckling and going down.
Is there a doctor in the house?
People jumping up, like everybody rising. He goes down and they go up.
Right.
Also, there would have been like a banner announcement or a banner hanging of what this conference was or whatever it was. He's kind of laughing and he's like, way to go out, you know, like way to leave this world, you know, right there and then.
Dubois stated that Keen is now as interested in communicating with the living as he once was in talking to the dead.
To try and understand better, like to understand the other side, what you guys are seeing that's right and what's not right, and almost to like try and help make that clearer.
I do believe in an afterlife. I'm not sure what that life will look like if we just go back into the source, but I just kind of live my life like we'll see when we get there.
Although some researchers continue to question whether the experiments featured in this film represent convincing evidence for an afterlife, for the leading investigators and participants, there is little doubt it does.
We actually saw the spirits.
Emily, when did you live on the Earth?
Oh, a long time ago now.
19th century?
Yes. Come on here.
I think we were pushing the barriers further than had ever been pushed before, and I think we just got to the stage where at that time we couldn't go any further.
In 1998, after 5 years and 500 sessions, the Scole Experiment finally came to an end. The Scole Experiment may be over, but today, in Italy, grieving parents continue to report hearing the voices of their dead children on Baci's radio. And Vicky Talbot says she continues to receive the voice of her deceased son, Braden, via EVP. But the debate about the authenticity and significance of this evidence continues to rage.
Now, according to science, when you physically die and when your brain stops functioning, that is it, that is the end.
The experiences that I've had have convinced me that it is very difficult to explain any of these things by an alternative explanation to that of survival.
You're not going to win everybody. I mean, you're not going to be able to ever have everybody believe that there's another side. That's just not going to happen.
I hope the significance of those experiments will literally be to make people think, to stop and think, and look at their own lives, to look at where they're going, perhaps to be better people.
You've been a long-time member of the Society for Psychical Research. Can you tell me how long you've been involved with the SPR and what offices you have held?
I've been a member of the Society for Psychical Research since the 1940s, but it's only in the last 10 or 12 years that I've been actively involved. And for the last, I suppose, 10 years, I've been acting as either chairman of the Image and Publicity Committee and secretary of the Survival Research Committee. Now, the Survival Research Committee is involved in encouraging research into aspects of the survival of human consciousness after death and into mediumship, which of course is associated with it. The Society for Psychical Research has an extraordinarily notorious reputation for being scientifically rigorous, and many people consider that it goes overboard in its skepticism. But in fact, it has been extremely, over the years, it's been extremely careful to ensure that the material that it produces, by and large, goes through the peer review system and is as scientifically kosher as anything can be. And indeed, because we are dealing with those things which are extraordinary, we consider that extraordinary things do require a much higher level of authenticity than would normally be required for things which are within the scientific paradigm. Indeed, over the years, the SPR has been responsible for exposing quite a number of hoaxes, starting with the rather notorious Hodgson report back in the 1880s into Madame Blavatsky, although his methodology has now been found to be a bit doubtful, but particularly with its investigations into physical mediums. And it was extremely difficult to get anything past the SPR's hierarchy, which appeared to show physical mediumship in a positive light. In more recent years, that has changed somewhat, but the rigour required of scientific investigation is really very high. Physical mediumship is where the medium, instead of merely conveying information orally, manages to be the means by which physical things are produced. Now, the physical things are very often, primitively speaking, table tapping, table raps, knocks and things of that nature. Advancing from that, there are things that move around the place, tables that actually get up and move or pull people around, and then the materialization of phantom forms in some form or other, very often and traditionally through the emanation of something called ectoplasm, which comes from different orifices in the medium's body. And this has been a subject of enormous controversy over the last more than 100 years. From the point of view of investigators, and I'm now looking at it as a Society of Psychical Research investigator, our object was to see whether the reports that we'd had of amazing physical phenomena being produced by this group of mediums in the village of Scole in Norfolk, whether those phenomena could be produced under conditions which positively excluded the possibility of fraud. And so our object initially, and indeed throughout the whole of our investigation, was to see whether, in agreement with the people sitting around the table, the group, and in agreement with the communicators from the other side, who were regarded by them as their mentors and who ruled the roost, as it were, we could agree upon procedures for the production of physical phenomena, particularly physical phenomena related to the production of films. The aims and purpose of the investigators of the Scole Group was to discover whether, in conjunction with them and by agreement with them, we could work out a series of protocols, a series of rules for the production of physical phenomena which would positively exclude any possibility of fraud. Initially, we were all pretty skeptical because what had been claimed seemed so way out. What had been claimed was primarily concerned with the production of pictures without cameras, without any form of manipulation by anyone. And this seemed to us to be worthy of investigation with a very critical hat on. Their initial claims were that they were in contact with a group of deceased entities who were producing, with their help, a number of pictures. The pictures which they reproduced were of either deceased persons or were films, strips of films, which they claimed to be produced without any cameras and in the dark. The report into the activities of the Scole Group was the result of some 2 years' investigation that my colleagues and I did. I wrote the report, which runs to about 250, 300 pages, and it was published by the Society in conjunction with my two principal colleagues, that's Professor Fontana and the late Professor Ellison. And as I say, it was published in 1999. When we started a typical session of Scole in this darkened cellar, we'd be sitting round a table. The only light at that stage would be small pieces of luminous tape so that we could see who was moving round their wrists. That's the group. There were 6 of them originally, and then it were only 4 because 2 of them left. We would start off with some sort of prayer or incantation to ask for divine blessing, etc. But it wasn't really religious in that sense. And then there would be music. Music was needed to stir the vibe somehow. After the music, it was usually Manu would come through, Manu was the introducer, and then he would disappear. Manu would give us a pep talk saying what was going to happen in that session and how much he welcomed us and how important it was, etc. And then invariably we would have the main female communicator, indeed the only female communicator, to come through, that Mrs. Bradshaw, though we got to know her first name and to call her by her first name when we got fairly intimate. And Mrs. Bradshaw, who was a very commanding figure, a lady of the upper class Victorian or Edwardian lady, or she sounded like that, and she would organise things and she would introduce other entities, male entities. She would tell us what was going to happen. She would comment on what we were doing and why we would be doing it, and indeed how we were behaving, and sometimes what we were thinking. She would answer our questions quite frequently before we'd actually asked them, which was quite embarrassing sometimes. I must say my most surprising incident in, I think, the first or second seance that I had was when, because at that stage we weren't at all sure that we would get reports available to us, transcripts available to us, which we thought was absolutely essential. I was making a note of everything in shorthand, which is pretty difficult to do in the dark, under the table. I mean, with their knowledge. The communications were coming through almost exclusively through one or other of the two mediums, husband and wife, both of them, as far as we knew, in total trance, and they were unconscious of what was happening. At a later stage, we did have some direct voice, that's to say, voices which appeared to be coming from right in front of us and which were not using the larynxes of the two mediums. However, this is something which was certainly our very strong impression, but we couldn't prove it one way or the other, so we tended to rather disregard these distinctions. When the voices came through the mediums, which they normally did, the voices were quite different from those of the mediums themselves, and the personalities behind the voices were not only quite different, but were very consistent, even the accents were. And we began to recognise, it was very easy to recognise the female one because there was only one, and she was very, very idiosyncratic. The ones coming through the male medium, there were several different ones. They all had distinctive voices, although I found it more difficult than some of my colleagues did to determine who was who. But there were several of them over the period of the year, and some of them had specialities. There was one very obvious one, Raji, who was described himself as a mad, dead Indian, and who would make jokes and had a very characteristic, rather schoolboy sense of humour. And he would have an interchange with the female medium, with the female communicator, Mrs. Bradshaw. Mrs. Bradshaw was really the woman in charge. She was the sort of major domo-ess, as it were, ushering people in and out and telling us who was going to come and who wasn't going to come. We don't exactly know, because it's all in the dark, exactly when the mediums do go into trance. In fact, we had no means of proving that they were in trance. But all the indications are that, unless they were lying, they were in trance. And they went into trance apparently quite quickly. We heard some deep breathings and some slight sort of moans, and that would be it. They would go into trance just like that. It's a question of training, apparently. And they would gradually come out of trance at the end of the session, and it was rather important that they should do so slowly, because if we switched on the lights suddenly, that would harm them. The leading character was undoubtedly Emily Bradshaw. She, I suppose, was sort of 60% of what came through, but there were others with various names. They only had their first names. We never discovered who they were supposed to be in reality. But there was Joseph, for example, who was a rather grave ex-scientist. We didn't really, there was Raji, who was a mad, dead Indian, I say, and who really contributed to the joyousness of the affair, because it was quite a jolly affair. There was an ex-Irishman who spoke in a distinctive Northern Irish accent, I think he described himself as a former priest. And there were one or two others who played more or less important part as different experiments were conducted. And when we had experiments which required expertise in a particular area, photographic area or area of reproduction and so on, apparently there were different experts available. But they weren't always directly available. They sometimes had to come through another entity on the other side and then through the mediums. So there was scope for misunderstanding and misrepresentation. The sessions were all recorded on audio, and we got transcripts of all of those that we participated in. And these transcripts were pretty lengthy, but they were an important part of our investigation procedure because we didn't want to rely upon our memory. The most spectacular aspect, which virtually all of the people who attended the Scole sittings have reported with amazement, were, I suppose, the lights. They would come on fairly quickly. The lights appeared to be animated in the sense that they were intelligently directed and intelligently moving and would be responsive to our wishes, whether expressed or silent. They would, the lights would be mainly orbs that would move around with incredible speed, sometimes performing all sorts of gyrations in the air, but able to somehow or other be solid enough to make noises when they hit the top of the table, or you could feel them when they landed on our fingers. On one occasion, one of my colleagues, Professor Grattan Guinness, without permission, had the light sitting on his hand and enclosed it. And having enclosed it, he turned his hand over in order to ensure there were no sort of connecting rods or links or wires. And it buzzed around angrily inside his cupped hands. And then when he released it, it disappeared. He got ticked off for this, not because it was wrong to do it, but because he hadn't asked permission. But it did indicate to him, to his satisfaction, and indeed I think to everybody else's, there was nothing physical that could have explained the movement of these very animated and intelligent little lights. We were never sure exactly what the lights were, except, because obviously we asked questions about it, except that they were animated spirits, but they weren't, as it were, fully formed. They weren't discarnate entities as we understand them. They were somewhere in between, but they were certainly animated, and they were certainly responsive to our wishes. I suppose the example of the lights which was most dramatic for me, and indeed for my colleagues who participated in it, it was a definite experiment. A light appeared and settled on one of the 4 pieces of crystal, about 4 inches long, and it irradiated the crystal, which was sitting right in front of me. The crystal then levitated in front of our eyes. We could see it glowing, and then descended into a Pyrex semi-translucent bowl, such that we could see the light glowing inside the bowl and the piece of crystal there. Then Arthur Ellison, sitting on my right, was invited to pick it up. He picked it up and satisfied himself that it was there and it was glowing, and he put it down again. He was asked right away to pick it up again. He picked it up, or he tried to, and his fingers closed right over it. In other words, he could see, and we could see, the essence of it, but not the reality of it. It had dematerialized. Then he was asked to pick it up again, and it rematerialized in his hand. Now, this dumbfounded him. This is what Arthur Ellison, after years and years of investigation, finally convinced him that this was real, because it couldn't have been faked in any way. And he had his head right over the top of the bowl in order to ensure that no hand or no instrument could interfere with it. Then the experiment was repeated because I wanted to do the same thing. I could hardly believe it. And exactly the same thing happened with me. And then on my left was David Fontana, and Professor Fontana insisted on having his go too, and it was repeated a second time. So that was, I suppose, the most dramatic aspect of the lights, as far as I was concerned, and also a pretty conclusive piece of evidence that something very paranormal was happening. Now, an apport, which we had some experience of, but not all that many, is something which materializes out of nothing. The most amusing one was where we had a bet with the entity that an experiment would fail. She said it would win, the experiment would work, and she bet us £0.50, an old-fashioned coin, that it would work. It didn't work, and we teased her about it. And the next session started with Manu saying, "Hold on a moment, we've got something for you." There was a big clang, which shouldn't have taken place because it was later found on the floor, which was carpeted. And we subsequently found a £0.50 as payment for her debt. And she said triumphantly, as this coin rattled to the ground, we couldn't see it, "Debt paid." That was an apport, and I've still got it here. It was amusing, but it was also quite significant. Of course, it could have been faked, because we don't attribute too much to that. But if you take all of these things together, the possibility of faking becomes steadily less and less possible. If you take all the phenomena within the whole of the Scole experiment over 2 years while we were there, I would say that the possibility of fraud and faking was nil. But if you take each individual particular phenomena and examine the circumstances under which each phenomenon was produced, you could perhaps argue that there's a gap here, a hole here, something which wasn't absolutely 100%. But taken them all together, I think that there's no doubt that they were genuine. Before we arrived, and one of the things that we were shown to convince us was a copy of a newspaper which was the Daily Mail of the 1st of April 1944, and it contained an article about the sentencing to 18 months imprisonment of a famous, or rather infamous, medium called Helen Duncan. And it was explained to us that this was in order that Helen Duncan, who was watching from the other side the proceedings, was going to give some indication of her presence. And lo and behold, this fairly pristine copy of the paper arrived. Well, we didn't regard this too evidentially, but because it was challenged later on by one of my colleagues, who said, look, it's quite possible to produce these things from reproductions, we took it to the leading research station in England, indeed in the world, on paper and printing, in order to have it analysed. And it was absolutely clear from their report, indeed I was there when they showed it to me, that first of all it was done on letterpress, which has gone out of existence virtually since the early 1970s, I would say. And also the quality of the paper was identical to the quality of the paper produced in the same year. It was newsprint produced during wartime, which lacked certain chemicals which you couldn't get hold of. So this was a genuine article which appeared 50 years after the event on their doorstep, and no one has been able to explain how it got there. While I can't swear exactly what happened to Rupert, because from his point of view, this was a unique experience. By that time I had become a little blasé, but there were frequent occasions when there were materializations of spirit forms with sufficient amount of light, the light being generated by all these orbs around, to enable us to see the outline of them. They looked like and were described as angelic forms. They certainly had some sort of physical substance, because quite frequently they would sweep against us as though a piece of gossamer or cotton wool or cobwebs had touched us. It was quite physical in that sense. And then they would disappear, but sometimes they would last sufficiently long for us to see them change shape and move around. But they were not at all in the same category as the traditional materializations of forms which came from ectoplasm and which would build up and walk around the place. That we didn't have. There was no ectoplasm involved, and indeed the energy involved in this appeared to be quite different from the traditional type of energy which produces physical energy, physical ectoplasm. The forms did vary quite a lot. They were shadowy, not substantial, but able to, you could actually feel them or they could feel you, and they would float around, you could almost see through them. On occasions, a hand would materialize. I mean, I'm thinking of one occasion when a hand grasped me and, as it were, stroked my left hand. The hand was sufficiently visible in the light for me to see the fingernails. The hand was quite warm and natural. I wanted to ensure that, of course, it wasn't a hand that had been produced artificially or someone was stretching over the table. It was in such a position that it couldn't have been produced from any normal source. I was told who the hand belonged to, actually. It was a well-known dematerialized entity on the other side who appeared to be one of the spirits underlying the investigations and supporting it. But the reasons for that are really quite involved, and we go into some details about that in our report. But the hand itself was caressing me for a time. It was a male hand, and it lasted for at least 2 to 3 minutes. And I found it, far from being spooky, a rather wonderful experience. And I'm a very cerebral and rather unemotional sort of bloke, but this I found quite impressive. This hand wasn't insubstantial, it was quite physical, and I could see it, and I couldn't see through it. It looked like a normal hand. But when I asked about what the hand appeared to be not connected to any body, Emily said rather tartly, "We don't deal in bits of bodies." But apparently they do deal in bits of bodies because there was no other body around, and there wouldn't have been physically room for it because it was on the table. So the mystery of the hand remained. I can't speak for the Solomon's book because they were talking about what the Scole Group told them, what happened both before and during our investigations. I naturally tended to concentrate upon what we experienced ourselves and to largely disregard as anecdotal, with all respect to the Scole Group, what they experienced. But of course we had to take into account the testimony of a large number of people who had attended their sessions and who were eager to give us their authentication of what happened, and this helps to build up. I mean, for example, we had someone who had been there on 3 occasions and who was a former member of the Magic Circle as a professional conjurer, an illusionist who was there specifically in order to see whether this could be faked in any way, and he was absolutely satisfied that it couldn't be. Now, that sort of evidence, although it was before we came on the scene, seemed to us to augment our own impressions of genuineness. While I can't swear exactly what happened to Rupert, because from his point of view, this was a unique experience. By that time I had become a little blasé. But there were frequent occasions when there were materializations of spirit forms with sufficient amount of light, the light being generated by all these orbs around, to enable us to see the outline of them. They looked like and were described as angelic forms. They certainly had some sort of physical substance, because quite frequently they would sweep against us as though a piece of gossamer or cotton wool or cobwebs had touched us. It was quite physical in that sense. And then they would disappear, but sometimes they would last sufficiently long for us to see them change shape and move around. But they were not at all in the same category as the traditional materializations of forms which came from ectoplasm and which would build up and walk around the place. That we didn't have. There was no ectoplasm involved, and indeed the energy involved in this appeared to be quite different from the traditional type of energy which produces physical energy, physical ectoplasm. Well, the forms did vary quite a lot. They were shadowy, not substantial, but able to, you could actually feel them or they could feel you, and they would float around, you could almost see through them. On occasions, a hand would materialize. I mean, I'm thinking of one occasion when a hand grasped me and, as it were, stroked my left hand, the hand was sufficiently visible in the light for me to see the fingernails. The hand was quite warm and natural. I wanted to ensure that, of course, it wasn't a hand that had been produced artificially or someone was stretching over the table. It was in such a position that it couldn't have been produced from any normal source. I was told who the hand belonged to, actually. It was a well-known dematerialized entity on the other side who appeared to be one of the spirits underlying the investigations and supporting it. But the reasons for that are really quite involved, and we go into some details about that in our report. But the hand itself was caressing me for a time. It was a male hand, and it lasted for at least 2 to 3 minutes. And I found it, far from being spooky, a rather wonderful experience. And I'm a very cerebral and rather unemotional sort of bloke, but this I found quite impressive. This hand wasn't insubstantial, it was quite physical, and I could see it, and I couldn't see through it. It looked like a normal hand. But when I asked about the hand appeared to be not connected to any body, Emily said rather tartly, "We don't deal in bits of bodies." But apparently they do deal in bits of bodies because there was no other body around, and there wouldn't have been physically room for it because it was on the table. So the mystery of the hand remained. Our main object was to produce these films under conditions which eliminated any possibility of hoaxing. So we would buy the film ourselves. We would load it either into a box or into a container, a security bag, depending on how we proceeded, the protocol changing rather from experiment to experiment. And then immediately afterwards, if it was, as it usually was, Polaroid film, we would take it out of the box or the bag ourselves so that no one else touched it, and then develop it ourselves in a special machine. And we could see then what the strips of films contained. On the assumption that they were able, or someone was able, to get hold of a sealed box and somehow or other manipulate it so that you could take out the film and put in another film which has already been prepared, and then seal the box again, all in the dark and without our knowledge and without hearing anything peculiar and so on. We found this hypothesis extremely improbable, and it presupposed an ability to manipulate a sealed box which had been padlocked in the dark by people who we were watching all the time and who had identification labels on their wrists. So I wouldn't say it was impossible, nothing's absolutely impossible, but extraordinarily unlikely that this could have been done. But in other cases there was no possibility because it was held in our hands all the time. We think there was no possibility in those cases where the box, a little tub containing the film, was put in a box. The box was held in the hands of the experimenter so that no one could get at it, no substitution was possible. And then the experimenter would take it away and develop it himself in front of other people in the special gadget which Polaroid had provided for developing 35mm films. That we thought was as foolproof as anything could be. It became quite clear that there was a learning curve on the part of the Spirit team, as there was on our part, because it was an interchange, groping forward to see what they could do, because they couldn't do everything we wanted. They wouldn't do it in the light, for example. They wouldn't have infrared. So we had to devise a protocol which would satisfy them, but also satisfy us. But there was definitely a learning curve. We persistently asked them to accept infrared cameras, and they said, not yet, we're not ready for it. It would interfere with the vibes, with the energy in some way. From our point of view, we could see no way in which this was likely or could be done. But then again, we don't understand how their method of communication or how their energy works. So we had to accept this with great reluctance. They made, as far as I can recall, no effort to explain in technical terms why that was the case. But on other occasions, they were able to discuss highly technical matters with us, which seemed to indicate a familiarity with technical matters which were sometimes quite beyond my competence. The film that we saw had a little diagram on showing how the germanium gadget, as we called it, should be modified in such a way by the introduction of 2 coils and where the coils were to go, with a little description in writing as to why it was going to enhance reception, and a little squiggle at the end, which we disregarded at the time. But then it occurred to us that this must be an initial. We were told to look at it for that purpose. And then I wrote to the Edison Memorial people in America, and they sent me a copy of one of his letters, which contained his initials, which looked almost identical to the signature on this film. Well, Arthur Ellison, then, having been given these instructions by none other than Edison, duly altered made these modifications. The modifications were introduced, but they didn't work very well. I mean, they improved the reception slightly. The idea was to get a communication on a tape in a recorder which had no microphone in it, so that this would be a clear indication of their communication from us to us. But by the time they were playing around with this and were practicing it, they wanted to go on to a different experiment. And this was indeed one of our problems, that instead of really completing something and trying it again and again until they got it absolutely perfect, it seemed as though there were a whole host of entities on the other side who were muscling in and eager to try it was their turn, thank you very much, because presumably it was pretty rare to have some group of people like this who were willing and able to be the instrument of producing these physical phenomena. So that was one of our frustrations. They wanted to move on to some new experiment before we were absolutely sure that we were 100% there. The germanium device was originally constructed because the entities asked Arthur Ellison and gave him very detailed instructions about how to do it, whether he could A, get a piece of germanium, and secondly, put it, and then they described in some detail how it was to be constructed, to be put under some sort of pressure, and they described what the pressure should be, and what the voltage should be, and how the coil was going to work, and all that sort of thing. It was meaningless to me. It meant something to Arthur Ellison, and it was virtually a type of primitive semiconductor, the sort of thing that preceded the development of silicon chips. Which is one of the reasons why Arthur Ellison was rather sniffy about it, because he didn't think it was very modern. But this is what they wanted, so he constructed the, with the help of the Scole Group. He supervised the construction of this little germanium gadget, as we called it. For me, perhaps the most significant type of communication, because it was directed personally at and to me as a sort of thank you for work that I'd done on another aspect of the puzzles that they had set us, was on the last occasion we had a full sitting with them. This was where we had a blank tape in a tape recorder from which the microphone had been removed. And at a particular moment, we started the tape recorder. We could handle it. We could see where the starting and stopping was. And at that time, the whole thing was also being recorded on a normal tape recorder. So that at the end, we had 2 tapes for half an hour, one recording everything that we heard, and the other was the tape where nothing at all should have come through and nothing at all ought to have been recorded. But in fact, there was a recording what I was told would be of significance to me. And it turned out that I soon recognized a piece of music which was very significant for me, because it was the first bit of classical music that I ever really knew well, and it had great emotional content. It was, in fact, the second movement of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, and it can be readily heard coming through. We heard it all coming through this machine, which had a tape on, which had no normal means of recording anything. And above this, there was a voice-over. The voice-over was giving some sort of pontifical message, which we couldn't quite understand, but it was clearly in English, and it sounded as though it was coming from the back of the stage of a Victorian melodramatic orator. But the important thing for me was the music that was a complete recording, very similar to that which I had been brought up on, where Rachmaninoff actually played his own piano concerto. And the whole of the orchestra was there on this tape. And obviously we asked about it, and they said, well, this is just a thought projection coming from us, as a thank you to me for having congratulated them on one of the earlier experiments, the so-called Wordsworth experiment. I think the most memorable one, from my point of view, was where we had a tape recorder from which the microphone had been removed, and in which we put in a blank tape. And apparently, as a present to me for my hard work, they said that they were going to bring something which was going to be, a music. And the music, I soon recognised, coming out of this machine, which was being held actually by my colleague David Fontana in his hand, having pressed the two buttons, record and play, which shouldn't have recorded anything at all, but it was recording Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, which had a lot of resonance for me. And there was a voice-over on top of it, which one could hear coming through. And this lasted for about 10 minutes or so, and then faded out. There was a lot of white noise too, but it was a very good example of something which shouldn't have been there at all. We didn't actually know when we'd set up the experiment what we were going to hear, but they said before we actually started pressing the buttons and recording whatever was supposed to be coming through, that they were going to do a gift for me, something to say thank you for my hard work. And it was going to be in the form of music, and there was a certain amount of badinage about why I should be given a gift when others didn't, and all that sort of thing. And then we began to hear music coming through the tape recorder with no microphone in it, which was being held by one of my colleagues on my immediate left. And the tape recording was of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, which was very meaningful to me. And above this, there was a voice-over that we couldn't quite recognize, but it was at the same time as the whole of this orchestral music was being played. I wasn't myself present when a film with the German poem came up, but the person who was were two close cooperators of ours, Walter Schnittger and his wife. And Walter Schnittger, obviously German, produced this, well, he had the film in a box. The box was sealed, and he subsequently opened it, produced the film with the German message on. The German message was a poem that no one has yet been able to trace. We originally thought it was written by a man called Ruckert, who wrote in the 19th century. It was sort of written in the style of the 1840s, 1850s, Sturm und Drang sort of style, but the actual poem itself was handwritten in a style which was more typical of the way in which the Germans wrote German in the 1920s. So there was a puzzle there. But the film, the poem was regarded by Germans as being very good quality. And we made terrific efforts to find out whether it had ever been published, whether anyone would recognize it. We wrote to all the German professors in virtually all the universities in the country, and also went to Germany for this purpose as well, but no one was able to trace who wrote it or where it came from. Why do the spirits choose to communicate in this particular cryptic manner? And I wish I knew the answer. It could be that they want to pose difficult problems for us, because the more difficult the problem and the more difficult it is to discover the solution to it, the more evidential it appears to be. If it's obvious, if, for example, someone like Napoleon came through and said, yeah, I can prove I was Napoleon, I was married to Josephine, well, everybody knows that. If, on the other hand, some highly obscure person comes through, and that has happened, and they say who they are, and there's absolutely no trace of them, it's not evidential. So you've got to find some way in which, if they want to prove afterlife, and that's the assumption that we go on, if they want to prove afterlife, they must find some way in which they can overcome this dilemma, by providing information which is not easy to get at, which is not readily available in the public domain, which shows some sign of intelligence and which is related to them in some way. Now, I don't think that that particular poem quite fits that bill. It was certainly arcane and certainly very specialized and very intelligent, and it did show that someone or other could provide what was regarded as a very well-written poem in German, which went way beyond any possible competence on the part of the Scole Group, if they had been able to fake it. We often asked ourselves why they chose this particular cryptic form of conveying information, and we really don't know the answer. I suppose it is because if they wanted to provide, say, evidence that a particular individual, Napoleon, was coming through, and we wanted to get him to authenticate this, and he said, well, I was married to Josephine. Well, everybody knows that, and he can't tell us anything that isn't in the public domain, so it's not evidential. If, on the other hand, it's someone highly obscure, and no one's ever heard of him, or we can't even trace him, well, that's equally non-evidential. So in a way, the reason, the motivation for providing something which is a puzzle, which is difficult to solve, is simply because it is difficult to solve. It isn't readily available. It can't be easily attributable to the person sitting around the table in that seance room. I think it could be argued that there was nothing which absolutely proved the afterlife as distinct from something that's emanating from the consciousness or the unconsciousness of the mediums. We were constantly on the lookout for clues, for things which went well beyond what the mediums were able to do or were likely to be able to do. And there were, I suppose, something like 15 or 20 such indications of things which we thought were extremely unlikely. We couldn't prove that they were impossible, but they would have presupposed a very considerable degree of information and knowledge on the part of the medium, which we thought was unlikely. For example, they provided information of a rather specialist nature about identifying and commenting on some of the music which was being played on background tapes. And we thought it very unlikely that any of the Scole Group, or particularly the medium himself, who was not particularly interested in music and knew very little about it, would be able to know. For example, we had, as a bit of background music, one of the commentators said in relation to background music, it was, I should say it was a tape recording of bits and pieces of classical music, in which 2 or 3 bars of classical music melded into another 2 or 3 bars, you know. I disapproved of it rather, but the entity on the other side was commenting on it. And then he made a comment on something which was reversed and going backwards and forwards, or going back from the middle and then you get back to the middle. Something which didn't seem to me to make, didn't seem to anyone to make any sense. And then I realized that what he was talking about was the particular variation of the Rachmaninoff Paganini variations, which is an inversion. Now, not a lot of people know that the inversion is number 18 in the variations. This is a very specialized bit of knowledge. I happen to know it because I'm interested in this sort of thing, but I'm pretty sure that the medium himself didn't know that. But it was coming from the other side, almost spontaneously. It wasn't something that sort of, he was priding himself on knowing a lot about the bits of music. He was trying to identify each fragment of music. It was a sort of game, as it were. So that's an example of the sort of thing I mean when I say we were looking for things all the time which couldn't be reasonably attributed to the mediums themselves. But taken in isolation, you can't say any one of these is proof of anything. The criticism that you don't get very much information which makes it clear what it's like to be in the afterlife is one that's always made. And I think it's always justified. The people on the other side say, look, we live in a totally different world in which we have none of the normal senses. We are just minds. And this is something, and also time doesn't mean anything. But you down here, you earthlings, can't understand this because you don't have the vocabulary, you don't have the conception to understand it because your world is limited by your 3 dimensions. Now, I think that is probably true. It's very irritating, but it's probably true that we can't understand what it's like to be in a world without time, for example. So inevitably, the impression that we get are pretty vague and rather general as to what life is like there. But you see, we were not primarily concerned at that stage to deal with these so-called ontological problems about the nature of afterlife. We were primarily there to get valid information, valid phenomena, which was fraud-free. And then we were going to go on to the more important philosophical questions. We never got to that stage. As far as I know, the photographic material that was produced, strictly speaking, it's not photographic because no cameras were involved, but the films produced were unique. I don't know of any other experiment where this sort of thing has happened. There have been plenty of cases where photography has taken place, where someone's mind has been projected and you get a film, a single film. But strips of film made in these circumstances, in the sort of conditions that we had at Scole, no, there's been nothing quite like that. The assumption or theory is that these pictures were created by a thought process, but the mechanism of it being created on this film is totally unknown. The only alternative explanation is they are all fakes, and I don't believe that there's evidence that that is the case. I think that those pictures can be explained only by imagining that the spirits can project their recollections and images onto a film in some way we can't begin to understand. I can see no other explanation, and I don't understand what that explanation is, of course. The way in which they actually transmit a sound onto a magnetic tape is something which we asked them about and on which we had some explanation. The explanation which is recorded in the Scole report is pretty technical, and I'm not at all sure that I understood it. It was given actually to one of my colleagues while I was conducting an experiment. And it talks about non-spin energy, for example, whatever that is. I mean, it's something that I think physics doesn't at the moment understand. And how in getting to the tape, there's a problem of a cut-off point. Now, there's a cut-off point associated with the use of silicon chips. It's a cut-off, which means that the silicon chips fail to operate beyond a certain temperature. And they identified this as a problem, and they said that the problem, and they told us how the problem would eventually be solved by something called, I think, silicon oxide. Or at any rate, they gave us the name of a chemical which they thought was likely to be the way in which this problem, which limits the use of semiconductors in all sorts of circumstances, will eventually be solved. In other words, there were technical discussions of a level which went way beyond anything that was likely to be attributable to the medium himself or to his subconscious. When we were having experiments in Ibiza on the tape recordings, Walter Schnittke, who was a technician, was asking questions of the spirits about the mechanism by which they got information on the tape. And I was astonished at the degree of technical detail that followed in the exchanges, detail far beyond anything likely to be reasonably attributable to the male medium who was speaking. It seems that from what we were told that the individual entities coming through were either specialists or were acting on behalf of specialists. Sometimes when we questioned them, they said they didn't know, but they'd have to find out. So the answer, I think, is that there were specialists on the other side, and it would be very difficult to explain the variety of things that came through unless there were specialists.
So in other words, there was a concerted effort by these spiritual entities to facilitate a bridge between the worlds.
I think it's pretty clear that there was a deliberate and a communal effort on the part of the spirit entities to prove survival and to cooperate in proving survival by a variety of different means and using their different specialities to do so. I think the impression that we got from the entirety of our experience was there was a group on the other side, including or with available information from specialists, whose anxiety was to find different ways in which they could prove the existence of the afterlife and their ability to communicate intelligently with us. We invited quite a range of different scientists from different disciplines because I wanted to give credibility to the whole of the experiment. what happened was that not all of them, of course, experienced the same thing, and not all of them were equally credulous, and some were more or less critical. But, for example, Grattan Guinness, who was a professor of mathematics, was not only so impressed, but he came to a public meeting and demonstrated how he had actually encapsulated the spirit of this orb in order to ensure that there could be no possible fraud. The two principal investigators, apart from myself, were two very highly qualified scientists. One was Arthur Ellison, who was an emeritus professor of electrical engineering, who'd been involved in this type of thing for many years, and Professor David Fontana, who's a professor of psychology. And they not only co-wrote the report with me, but attended most of the sittings that I attended. So there were three of us, all fairly experienced, there, primarily in order to check against any possibility of fraud. But in addition, we did invite a number of other scientists to experience it too. One of them was Dr. Sheldrake, another was Professor Grattan Guinness, another was the present president of the Society for Psychical Research, who came on two different occasions. And there were Professor Archie Roy also attended. He's a professor of astronomy. So we had a range of expertise on our side to match the expertise on their side. And in some cases they could use, as Archie Roy did, his specialist knowledge of a particular area of astronomy in order to have an intelligent exchange about astronomical issues with the other side. I think historically speaking, if you take the whole of the phenomena in the Scole Group, it ranks among the most profound pieces of evidence for the existence of an afterlife. I don't know what happens when we die, but I'm quite convinced from all my experience, including the experience of the Scole experiment, that a consciousness survives, an intelligence survives in some form or other, and that what survives is mind and not anything else, but that mind can create its own environment, so that you do have people on the other side who can smoke cigars and listen to music and play games and walk through, because all of this is of their own creation. That's something which we find extremely difficult to envisage. But I'm quite sure that that's the sort of home that awaits us. What I'm not at all clear about is the relationship between the individual when he dies and the group consciousness of which he appears also to be a part. I think that at some stage or other our entities merge into a group consciousness on the other side. What happens to it then as it goes off into the light, I simply don't know, nor does anyone else. I think the skeptics regard the possibility of the survival of human consciousness as inherently so impossible that anyone must be rather crazy to believe it. But when you look at the evidence, you have to ask yourself whether you'd be even more crazy not to believe it, or to find some alternative explanation which makes any sort of sense, and I haven't found one. I think it's apparent, though you can't prove it, that the progress that a person makes, I don't mean intellectual progress, I mean spiritual progress, whatever that means, in his life here, determines the point of departure, as it were, in the next world. It may be that he's not even ready to go there and he hangs around here and turns into a poltergeist or a ghost and can't be moved on. Or he's got some unfinished business here which prevents him from moving up the ladder, as it were. But all the indications are, and all the evidence from the other side, for what it is worth, is that there is a hierarchical structure, and that the idea is that the person, by self-improvement in some way, with help, moves up to a higher spiritual plane. It's not something I may say I look forward to, but this is what I conclude from the evidence that's available. Well, I don't particularly want to have anything other than pure death. Thank you very much. I rather enjoy living here. I cannot envisage really what it's like to be on the other side, and I would rather not believe in survival, but I find it impossible to be intellectually honest and not believe in survival. I mean, whatever we're going to see and experience is something that we can't quite understand or accept now, and there's so many question marks about it that the easier thing to do is to say, well, I don't want to be involved in it, you count me out. When I'm dead, thank you very much, that's it. But I don't believe that to be true. I mean, I think that's just a way of running away from the facts. I'm sure that belief in the afterlife ought to have changed the way I live my life, make me a better person. I'm not aware that it has done, actually, but theoretically, at any rate, I'm quite sure that it helps a lot of other people, and it may even help me when I get to old age, which is any day now. One of the odd things about survival experiments and survival information is the almost universal agreement that there is an immediate review of your whole life when you die, and that there's no crime and punishment of the hell and damnation sort, but it's a process of self-revelation, self-education. How that is done and exactly what happens to the individual during this process is, to my mind, a big question mark. Whether he's reincarnated in order to learn more and then goes back again, I don't know. The evidence for reincarnation, I think, is very profound indeed. I think that if we look for consensus on the other side, we are presupposing something which I believe to be false. And that is that once you get to the other side, you're immediately available for all information, all the mysteries of the world are suddenly revealed to you. And I think that it was Myers who said it's as silly to imagine that once we get to the other side, all mysteries are revealed and all knowledge is available to us, as it is to imagine that a small baby born on your world is immediately possessed of an understanding of how the world works. So there is a hierarchy on the other side of people who've just moved over, who just have no more knowledge of what they're about as they had when they were on this side, and are beginning to learn. And then they move on to higher levels of spirituality where they can intelligently answer a lot of the questions that we pose. But maybe they can't answer those questions in a form which is immediately accessible to us, understandable to us. The fear of death is undoubtedly a profound phenomenon among virtually all people. And I think that once a person is persuaded of the evidence in whatever way that there is an afterlife and that consciousness continues, and they can possibly communicate with their deceased ones on this side, the fear of death begins to evaporate. And it may diminish completely. And if that is the case, then it's a complete justification for all the efforts made by people like me for investigating the evidence. I certainly think it can be argued that eliminating or reducing the fear of death by being persuaded that there is an afterlife does or can change people in all sorts of ways. I don't think it's changed me particularly, at least I'm not conscious of it, but by reducing the fear of death and knowing that they can possibly live again or that there's something afterwards, they should become rather less concerned with material problems and more concerned with living a decent life. How do I know that the spirit voices really did come from the afterlife rather than from the mediums themselves? We don't know that. We simply have a number of clues of information which was extremely unlikely to have derived from the subconscious mind or the conscious mind of the medium. And the more impressive those are, the less likely it is that you can say that this is an aspect of mediumship. And the more likely it is, it's an aspect of discarnate communication. few seconds here.
And this is for a television audience worldwide.
Yep.
Any system of thought, including contemporary science, has sort of boundaries of what's permissible and what isn't. And there's a kind of taboo about things that go beyond that. Within science, based on a materialist point of view, the mind is the brain. So anything that suggests the mind might be more than the brain goes against the theory, and therefore most scientists don't want to know about it. So there's a very powerful taboo. When people say that the paranormal is paranormal, they don't usually mean that these are things that don't happen. For example, telepathy is extremely common in the modern world. Most people have experienced it. Some people experience it on a daily basis in connection with phone calls. But that doesn't mean it's paranormal, it means it's normal, it happens. It's only paranormal from the point of view of a theory that says it's impossible. If the mind's in the brain, telepathy ought not to happen. So if it does, it's theoretically paranormal. In actual fact, it's normal. Scientific materialism is the belief that the mind is nothing other than the brain. Mental activity is brain activity. All our consciousness is inside our head. And in fact, most people would usually assume consciousness is confined to a small layer at the top of the cerebral cortex. So it's the theory that the mind's in the brain and can't in any way be detached from the brain or stretch out beyond the brain. The paranormal is defined in relation to the normal. It means beyond the normal. Therefore, to define it implies that we know what the normal is. In science, this is often taken to be the materialist theory. Materialists believe that the mind is nothing but the brain. Therefore, anything that suggests the mind can have an influence at a distance, as in telepathy, or become detached from the brain, as in survival of bodily death, is by definition paranormal, beyond the normal. But this is a theoretical definition, and in science we're meant to look at evidence. And if we look at the evidence, we get a very different picture. Things like telepathy are common. The majority of the population say they've experienced it. So it happens. It's evidence, there's a lot of evidence, scientific evidence it happens. So it's normal, not paranormal. It's only paranormal from the point of view of a particular theory. And science isn't committed to particular theories. Science doesn't have to adopt the materialist ideology as its basis. Science is a method of inquiry where we can find out by looking at evidence and constructing hypotheses and understand the world better through proper investigation, not dogma. The only way to find out what's really going on is through investigations. If lots of people have had an experience of a particular kind, then we could say it's normal for people to have this experience. How we explain it is another question. Then we need to investigate that by science. One of the problems with research in this area is that because of the taboo, there's virtually no funding for this area, so there's very little research. Now, the funding is decided by central committees of scientists, and they reflect scientific prejudices and consensus values. It's partly a political question, and I think in a democracy a certain percentage of science funding should be spent on research that actually interests voters. At the moment it's all decided by small committees of science establishment people and representatives of big business. But there's no reason why in a democracy some scientific research shouldn't reflect people's interests. There's no doubt that a great many people are really interested in these questions of survival, of the existence of psychic phenomena, and so on. And if science funding reflected the interests of the population, then a huge amount of money would go into these fields rather than none. Science is not committed to any particular ideology or worldview. It's a method of inquiry. There's a dominant materialism in science that grew up in the 19th century. It's become part of the culture of science, but it's really a dogmatic belief system rather than a testable theory. Things that don't fit in with it, the evidence against materialism, like a lot of the evidence for psychic phenomena, is simply dismissed or treated as taboo. So it's really a matter of maintaining a belief system, and that, in my opinion, is extremely anti-scientific. Science is not about dogma, it's about investigation. Theoretical frameworks are helpful, but we don't have to have a theoretical framework for phenomena we don't understand. We find out about them by investigating them. And people had, they were investigating fossils before Darwin came up with the theory of evolution. They had various theories, but they weren't very solid ones. Some people thought they were left by the flood and so on. we investigate a lot of things in science, like quasars in cosmology, whose nature is unknown. And if you said you can't investigate anything unless you understand it, science would never have got off the ground in the first place. Superstition is really believing something on the basis of a habit, a cultural habit. You're told about it, you go on believing it, even in the absence of any evidence. Well, I would say that in some ways the materialist dogmas of science are a kind of superstition, a belief that anything that doesn't fit into this way of thinking can't possibly exist. It's a kind of anti-superstitious superstition. I think the real question is we need to investigate things on the experimental basis. If a lot of people believe in telepathy, for example, maybe it's a superstition, maybe it really happens. The only way to find out is to study the phenomenon and find out whether it happens or not to adopt the view that it's a superstition, a prejudice against it, and then close off any inquiry. That way we find out nothing. We remain trapped in our belief system. The scientific method is to do with having hypotheses and testing them by means of experiment. It's a method of experimental inquiry. This is, of course, physical in the sense that you're looking at physical evidence, but the kinds of questions you ask depend on ideas that go beyond science and which are called metaphysical. And materialism, for example, is a metaphysical doctrine. It says that the only physical reality is matter. Now, it doesn't prove that. It says it. It starts from that as an assumption. And with that assumption, you investigate what matter does. Anything that doesn't appear to be explicable in terms of matter is regarded as non-existent, as a metaphysical assumption. Every kind of science starts from some kind of metaphysics, a belief in the larger framework within which science takes place. And in scientific revolutions, there's a challenge to the existing metaphysical doctrines, and they're replaced by something else. Another doctrine in modern science is that nature is governed by laws that are fixed for all time and were all there at the moment of the Big Bang. We can't possibly prove that. We can't go back in time to the Big Bang to see if all the laws of nature were there. My own view is that they might have evolved, that even the laws of nature evolve, or that they're more like habits. So science is always based on metaphysical assumptions. This is necessary, but the methods of investigation through experiments look at physical evidence. If one says that the conscious experiences that people have during a near-death experience are produced by the brain, they would rather depend on brain activity. But there's new evidence from Pim van Lommel in the Netherlands. It shows that in fact in people having near-death experiences the brain was completely flat-lined. There was no measurable electrical activity of it at all. He actually had electroencephalographs on people's brains when they underwent near-death experiences, and he was able to show that the brain activity, the chaotic brain activity or the hyperactivity that some people postulated just wasn't going on. The brain was to all intents not active at all. So here we have conscious experiences associated with a brain that doesn't seem very active. He thinks that this evidence, the best evidence we have so far, suggests that consciousness can operate independently of the brain. Acquiring information when in an out-of-the-body state, as in an out-of-the-body experience or near-death experience, only tells us that people can acquire information somehow. It doesn't necessarily prove that their centre of consciousness has moved outside the body, or that they're acquiring it by some strange means from a centre outside the body. It's conceivable it's being acquired by the body and then entering their consciousness, wherever that centre of consciousness appears to be. The evidence seems to me ambiguous, and I don't think you can draw any firm conclusion one way or the other. Even if somebody knows what's going on somewhere else, if you take seriously the idea of telepathy, you see it's possible they picked it up telepathically from someone who knew what was going on there. As soon as you allow for things like telepathy, which personally I think are well supported by evidence, then you don't have to assume that they go out of the body and see something with disembodied eyes. They could have picked it up telepathically from someone else who was seeing it. That may seem improbable. In fact, both explanations seem improbable, really. But, you know, we're going to have to choose between improbable explanations to explain this kind of evidence.
We don't know how telepathy is working, you see. If we don't know that telepathy is necessarily working through the brain. So if the fact the brain's flatline doesn't prove that telepathy is impossible in that state, my own view is that telepathy is a field phenomenon, that our minds are fields of activity, and that telepathy depends on field connections. Now, those fields may or may not be detachable from the brain. That's very much an open question. But one can't say that the telepathic acquisition of information has to depend on a functioning brain. I mean, we just don't know. We're in the realm of the unknown here. I think that telepathy tells us that our consciousness is not simply confined to our brains, that there are links between people at a distance which enable information to be transferred. I've done a lot of work on telepathy. I think the evidence is extremely strong. It shows the mind is more than the brain, and it implies that the mind is like a system of fields that project out beyond the brain, just as a cell phone has invisible fields that go beyond the surface of the cell phone, or a magnet has fields that go beyond the surface of the magnet. So I think our minds extend beyond the brain. Telepathy is consistent with a field theory of the mind, but in these examples telepathy is still rooted in the brain. Now, near-death experiences and out-of-the-body experiences rather suggest that the centre of consciousness can be detached from the brain. If telepathy is a system of fields, then the question is, can these fields leave the brain and be sort of free-floating in space? Now, that's quite a big jump, and I find it rather hard to know what to think about that. I'm perfectly happy with the idea of fields extending around the brain to explain telepathy, which is a much less challenging phenomenon than these out-of-the-body experiences or evidence for communication from the dead. Telepathy is, pretty close to ordinary kind of scientific reality, in my opinion, and relatively simple to understand. These things go much further and are much more challenging, and I honestly don't know the answer. I'm never quite sure what people mean when they say consciousness is non-local. I think consciousness is located normally in our bodies. I mean, we have a point of view which is normally located inside our bodies. My point of view now is based on where I'm sitting. It's not distributed at random anywhere in the universe. It's centered here. I can have non-local interactions. If I have a telepathic communication with somebody in Australia, then there's an influence that doesn't seem to be dependent on distance or locality that passes between us. But that person is also localized in a particular place in Australia. So you can have non-local interactions. And in physics, when people talk about non-local interactions, they mean that one thing and another thing can be linked at a distance in a way that doesn't seem to depend on how far apart they are. But these things nevertheless have locations. To say non-local in a general sense implies that it has no place, no locality. All our conscious experience has locality. Even out-of-the-body experiences have a location for the consciousness near the ceiling of the room, for example. It's still located at a particular point in this physical universe. So it's a little confusing to use the word non-locality as if it implies that nothing has a place. I think that our normal consciousness works through fields, that in perception, our perceptual world is projected out. I think vision involves light coming into the eyes and the visual world being projected out. So if you see me sitting here now, your image of me isn't inside your brain, where the materialists say it is. It's where it seems to be. It's projected out by you to where I'm sitting. So consciousness involves a system of fields, of perceptual fields, that are going on the whole time, even in ordinary experience. Our mind isn't confined to the inside of the brain, any more than the field of a magnet's confined to the inside of the iron bar. Nevertheless, normally the consciousness is rooted in the brain. There are two circumstances when we experience our consciousness as not being rooted in our brain, as being located in some other body or place. And the first, and in my opinion the most important and interesting, is in dreams. Everybody's had the experience of having a centre of consciousness outside their physical body during dreams. I may dream that I'm running along the road, even flying, and yet my physical body's asleep in bed. So every one of us has a dream body, an alternative body, and another kind of body that we experience subjectively from within on a nightly basis. which has a world going on around it, and in our dreams we're centred in this body. We may not always be conscious or aware of it, but we always have a point of view centred in this body. So everybody knows from the experience of dreams that we can experience our consciousness as being located somewhere other than in our physical body. Sometimes in dreams we dream about familiar places. Sometimes we're dreaming about fantastical places that don't really exist. But it shows that our body can occupy a space in a kind of conscious realm of possibility or imagination or conscious construction that's not inside our body. I think the best way of understanding the out-of-the-body and near-death experiences is to see this as being close to the dream phenomenon, where our dream body, or something like our dream body, becomes detached from our ordinary body, just as it does in dreams. It's just that they're more clear, or we're more aware of what's going on. And this does in fact occur in a particular class of dreams called lucid dreams, dreams where people know they're dreaming, and they're aware that they're in their dream body, and they can go where they like, and they have gain a kind of power over the dream state. This is something practiced by shamans in traditional cultures. It's something that many people have had spontaneously in our own. So to me, the key to the question is understanding the dream body, because that's the normal experience that all of us have had, even if we've never had an out-of-the-body experience. In our dreams, we've all experienced being outside our normal body, in some other body, or in some other centre of consciousness. Well, the dream body is sometimes called the astral body, and so some people call the conscious control of out-of-the-body experiences astral projection. I don't think the word astral helps us very much. I prefer the word dream body, because dream body is so clear, it's plain English, and everybody knows that they've got a dream body because they've all experienced it. If you talk about astral bodies, then it brings in a whole esoteric nomenclature that's rather puzzling. The word astral suggests a connection with the stars, and it's not at all obvious why you should call this dream body after the stars. We may think of our dreams as fantastical and unreal, and in many ways they are. But when we're having a dream, when we're dreaming, it seems real enough to us, and a nightmare can be genuinely frightening. It's not just imaginarily frightening, it's really frightening. And a wet dream in a man is, really wet. I mean, this is things are actually happening in the dreams. It's not just a fantastical realm. So to dismiss our dream experience on the grounds it's not real is something we only do on the basis of a comparison with waking life. Now, say you float out of your body and you have a near-death experience, and this is like being in a dream. And say it's not a near-death experience, say it's a real death experience. What happens if you go on floating and you're, as it were, trapped in a kind of dream body state, a dream body world? The difference from an ordinary dream is you can't wake up any longer because you haven't got a living body to wake up into. And what if survival of bodily death is rather like being in a dream from which you can't wake up? That seems to me the most plausible way of thinking about it, in fact, because we already know from our own experience we can be in a realm of conscious experience with a kind of body in our dreams that's not the same as the ordinary realm. We already know that our dreams are tremendously influenced by our preoccupations, our fears, our desires. We can have nightmares, which are usually about being trapped or unable to escape, or being chased or being threatened by some destructive force, like a monster. All these things may happen after we're dead, and people may have a great range of different experiences after they're dead, depending on the kind of person they are. It might be like being in a dream from which you can't wake up. I think it's much easier to approach the subject of survival of bodily death by starting from our experience, and particularly our experience of dreams, than it is to start from brain physiology. After all, we know very little about the connection between brain physiology and consciousness. The assumption in conventional science it's all inside the brain, I think, is false anyway, because I think our minds are fields that stretch out beyond the brain. So starting from dreams, I think, is the best way of beginning to understand what might be going on in these various experiences. In trying to understand after-death communications and other kinds of influence from people who are apparently dead, assuming it's not just a matter of telepathy, for me the interesting question is looking at dreaming people. Can someone who's dreaming have an influence at a distance by visiting that place in their dream body? In a lucid dream, people can actually will where they go. They go and visit friends, they say they've seen things happening. And sometimes in those cases there are reports that people have seen them or felt a presence, or an animal in the room has reacted as if somebody was there. In other words, the projection of their dream body to a particular place, in what's sometimes called astral projection, does seem to have effects in that place in some cases. Now, perhaps such a person could even influence or even possess somebody in that place to, start saying things or communicate through somebody or bring about even physical influences. I don't know. I think that that's the place to look research-wise, the evidence for people in lucid dreams being able to influence things at a distance. If they can, then we'd have, from the study of lucid dreams, the idea that a dream body can bring about effects under certain circumstances, can even be seen or have the presence felt by others. This would then be relevant to the whole question of a dream body theory of survival, because after somebody's dead, perhaps the same kind of thing could happen. They could appear in particular places, bring about effects, people could feel their presence. It might be that the ability some people seem to have to influence others or to have effects in particular places when they're in their dream state, in the dream body, is comparable to what happens after people are dead, the evidence for survival from communication through mediums and so forth. I think in this whole field of research people have ignored too much the evidence from dream research because I think it's highly relevant, and I think it's the main clue we have about the nature of what's going on in these survival states. Science has done very little to investigate the afterlife or reincarnation. Most materialists assume that both of them are impossible. So there's a kind of dogmatic denial by some scientists of the possibility of these things. But I wouldn't say that was a scientific understanding. I would say that was a dogmatic, ideologically motivated dismissal. The only way to have a scientific understanding is to do the research and to find out what's actually happening and to look at the evidence. In relation to reincarnation, the best evidence is from Ian Stevenson's studies on children who remember previous lives. I think he's established beyond doubt that some children have memories that correspond to things that happened in previous lives that they couldn't have known otherwise. Now, that doesn't necessarily prove reincarnation. What it shows is there's been a transfer of memory. My own view is that we all tap into a kind of collective memory, and perhaps in these cases there's a specific transfer of memories from particular people. Maybe it's reincarnation, maybe it's memory transfer. And even if these children have been reincarnated, does that prove that everyone else has been and we've just forgotten all the details? Or does it mean that reincarnation, even if it is reincarnation, is a rare exception? Personally, I think it's an exception rather than the rule. And in Stevenson's cases, the previous personalities, the memories that were remembered, are highly non-random. They show the majority of the people were murdered and the others died violent or sudden deaths. So it's a particular category of people who seem to have past life memories, or at least a particular category of past life. So it may be exceptional rather than the rule. To distinguish between a transference of memory and real reincarnation in cases where people have memories from previous lives would be difficult. One way would be to see whether you can have two people with the same memories at the same time. And I think there are such cases. That would then argue against a reincarnation theory that said you have a kind of unit soul that goes from body to body. But I suppose reincarnationists could say, oh well, sometimes it splits up like twins and you've got, and you can go into two bodies at the same time. So it's hard to find a conclusive experiment to distinguish between reincarnation and memory transfer. But it also leads us into philosophical questions. What is it that your personality is? You know, in Buddhist philosophy, there is no such thing as the core personality. There's just a bundle of memories. and you may have some memories from some person in another life, but that doesn't prove that the very essence of you has moved over from that other life. And indeed some schools of Hinduism, where reincarnation is widely accepted, say that what's moving from life to life is only a few memories or dispositions, but the essence of the self is not personal at all. It's Atman and Brahman. This is the ultimate principle. It's present in all people, and you can't really say that it moves from one to the other. One analogy they give is that if you have buckets of water and you see the moon reflected in the buckets of water, if you see it first in one bucket and then in another, it's not that the moon's jumped from one bucket to another. It's both of them are reflecting something that's beyond themselves. So even in Eastern philosophy, there's no clear, easy to grasp concept of reincarnation that would enable us to decide between memory transfer and reincarnation. So this leads us into very deep areas of philosophy as well as science. Some of Stevenson's most impressive evidence comes from these birthmark cases where people have birthmarks corresponding to wounds that apparently were usually to do with the murder of the previous personality. Here I think it shows that there are inherited influences that affect not just the memories but also the body itself. I myself think that the inheritance of body form takes place through a process I call morphic resonance. I think that that, as well as memory, depends on a kind of collective memory principle. So even if there's a transfer of some features of a previous body, like birthmarks, where bullet wounds were, you could have a kind of body memory transfer. But again, that wouldn't necessarily prove an individual reincarnation theory. It would show that there was a strong influence from a particular previous person that's influenced both the body and the mind of a later person. A transfer of memories, but it wouldn't necessarily prove that they were that person. This really then becomes a matter of what you would believe on philosophical or theological grounds about what reincarnation is and what the essence of the person is. I don't know how the reincarnation birthmark cases work, how to explain those. A reincarnation would be one possibility, but there would also be a possibility of transfer of memory through the fields that shape the growing body, what I call morphic fields, which depend on a kind of memory and influence from the past. And if there's an influence from a particular person in the past with bullet wounds or something that influences this body as it grows in the embryo, there's certainly something working through the field influencing the form from a particular person in the past as part of a collective influence from lots of other people in the past. It's a kind of memory effect, but it doesn't necessarily prove complete reincarnation. After all, the newly born child or the young child who has the memories doesn't look exactly like the other person. It's not as if their entire bodily form has been transferred from one body to another. It hasn't. They look different. It's just they resemble them in certain features. And when they have conscious memories of previous lives, it's not as if the whole of their memory is filled with these memories. They say these things sometimes, but they have other things in their minds as well, and quite often they forget these memories of past lives by the time they're 7 or 8 years old. So it's not as if there's a total package deal where an entire bodily form, an entire set of memories, habits and dispositions is shifted from one body to another. There's a transfer, even on the best available evidence, Stevenson's evidence, of certain influences among others, and those others have come from other people in the past. I think we're all a kind of composite. People who have memories of previous lives may have specifically enhanced memories of certain people in the past, but this is not the whole of their personality, nor is it the whole of their bodily form. It accounts for certain marks, like birthmarks, but not the shape of their nose, the size of their face, even their sex, because some people are born as boys when the previous personality was a girl. These are pretty major differences. The Scole experiments were done carefully, and they were done as properly as was possible under the circumstances. And all of us would have liked to have infrared sensitive cameras filming what was going on and more light in the room. But this is something that, for various reasons, they wouldn't or couldn't agree to. Now, the cynics would say this is because they'd got something to hide. they would say this is because these phenomena can only manifest in darkness, and it wouldn't be possible to look at them under these conditions, and for some reason they didn't want it to be filmed with infrared cameras. So this is something which the scientists and the psychical investigators involved were very keen to try and have done, but it was just not something that the mediums or the spirits that spoke through them would agree to. So unfortunately the evidence isn't as conclusive as it would have been if phenomena had been captured on film and there'd been sufficient light in the room to rule out certain other explanations. When I attended a sitting in Scole with the Scole Group, this was in a basement. It was dark. The mediums wore luminous bands around their wrists so that you could see where their arms were. But apart from that, there were no lights in the room, and so it was extremely dark. In the course of the session, there were things where lights appeared. At one stage there were small lights darting around the room, and my mind was trying all the time to think of so-called rational explanations for this. I thought at first that the lights must be small light-emitting diodes suspended on the end of nylon fishing line type things. And I've more or less come to the conclusion that's what was happening, that they must have found some way of waving fishing rods around with these lights on the end. When the light came down in front of it, went pop, went through the table and came out the other side, and then floated up the other side. Now, no nylon fishing line explanation would account for it going through an apparently solid, well, it was a solid object, a table. So there were things there that I just couldn't understand in terms of any normal kind of explanation. This is where people who are experienced conjurers and illusionists come in, and they always say, oh, well, there's a way of doing it, we can trick people and so on. The trouble is you get into this shadowy realm where you get claims from illusionists who claim to have a superior knowledge of all these tricks. I don't know of any that have duplicated that trick or shown how it could be done. I mean, it doesn't seem like a trick, but I mean, I couldn't stop all these skeptical thoughts flooding through my mind as I sat there seeing these things happen. At one stage, a disembodied hand appeared, and appeared to be floating over the table. I asked Mrs. Bradshaw, who was speaking through one of the mediums, if this was a disembodied hand. I said, I can see a disembodied hand. She said, it's not a disembodied hand. I said, you mean it's got an invisible body attached? And she said, precisely. And then she said, would you like it to touch you? And I said, yes. So she said, well, ask it. So I said, hand, will you touch me? And so the hand went round behind me and it tapped me on the shoulder. And then I saw it moving down and again floating over the table. Well, this again was extremely difficult to make any sense of. My mind went into overdrive thinking of explanations, you know, hands that were somehow with strings holding them up, and I mean, trying to think how this could be done through some kind of cheap conjuring trick. I couldn't think of any explanation of that kind. And then, when I was there, a crystal on the table started glowing and moving around. So there were some lights from these apparently self-luminous objects. And so there were a number of strange physical movements and phenomena which were exceedingly hard to understand, which didn't make sense in any normal terms, which, if they were conjuring tricks, would have required extraordinary ingenuity. And I couldn't see any evidence that the people were moving around or doing this kind of thing, nor, since they seemed decent, honest, quite ordinary people, could I see why they'd want to get up to such elaborate tricks as these. So I was completely baffled by the entire experience. And I really couldn't see, even if you accept the afterlife explanation, that these really were disembodied spirits speaking through the mediums. I still couldn't understand why, even if they were disembodied spirits, they want to make little light-emitting diode-type lamps whiz around the room, or have disembodied hands appear, or make crystals float in the air and glow with a mysterious light. And the whole thing was utterly baffling, even if one took it at face value. These occurrences were evidences of something very strange happening. You could perhaps call it psychokinesis, which is mind over matter effects. But say there were real mind over matter effects going on as opposed to conjuring tricks, then how do we know they were coming from the minds of the disembodied people rather than from the minds of the mediums who were sitting in the room? In poltergeist phenomena, disturbed adolescence typically can be associated with the movements of solid objects. I've investigated a poltergeist case in North London. It involved bottles of Bailey's Irish cream being flung across rooms, writing appearing on walls, items of furniture toppling over, and so forth. These are quite big physical effects, bigger than any I saw at Scole. Yet we don't invoke disembodied people who are dead to explain these. These seem to be associated with mental disturbances in the mind of a teenager, in this case, a teenage girl. So if minds can produce these kinds of effects and do so in poltergeist-type phenomena, then minds might have been producing them at Scole, but then the question is whose mind? Were they coming perhaps through the unconscious minds of the mediums who may not consciously have been causing these effects any more than disturbed adolescents consciously cause poltergeist phenomena? Or were they caused by seemingly discarnate spirits like Mrs. Bradshaw, who seemed a very respectable middle-class lady from Cambridge in the early part of the 20th century? But even if it was Mrs. Bradshaw, why would she have wanted to make small lights whiz around the room?
I'm a full professor of psychology with particular interest in transpersonal psychology. I originally trained as a child psychologist and then went on from there, trained in psychotherapy, and I've been an academic and research psychologist for many years. I've always been interested in paranormal research. I'm often asked why I became interested in it. I can't remember a time in my life when I've not been interested in it. The paranormal is that mysterious area behind the seen and the known world. And since most of the world is unseen and unknown, and most of the world is full of mystery, for me it's a fascinating and absorbing area. And it links in, of course, with the whole question of survival and the nature of mind. Answer the question, who are we? What is our real nature? Are we just a biological accident? Is there more to it than that? Do we live life without meaning and die without hope? Or is there some much broader spectrum within which we're a part? The Society for Psychical Research, or SPR for short, was set up in 1882. In fact, it's the oldest scientific society in the world devoted to exploring the paranormal. And by that we mean those faculties of man which cannot be explained under known laws. We've had 12 Nobel Prize winners as members. We've had many Fellows of the Royal Society. Some of the finest scientists in Britain, in fact, have been members, and many scientists from America have also been members. I've always been interested, within the context of the paranormal, in mediumship, because clearly mediumship provides a channel, or a supposed channel, between this world and the next. Physical mediumship is a particular area of mediumship, and it has the advantage in that what you see is fairly objective. In other words, all the investigators should see the same thing and, within reasonable limits, agree upon what they see. The Society for Psychical Research has been investigating physical mediumship on and off for over 100 years. We got involved in Scole, which is one of the best cases, although I've had many other experiences of physical phenomena. We got involved with Scole as a result of invitation, and for 2 years, once a month, we had sittings there with a group. It consisted of 4 people. There were 2 mediums who were in trance and the 2 organisers, and then the 3 experimenters from the SPR, myself and 2 colleagues, all highly experienced investigators, all trained scientists. By the time I investigated Scole, I'd had many other experiences. If I hark back very briefly to my first experience, which was that of a poltergeist case, poltergeist haunting. Poltergeists are supposedly noisy, mischievous spirits, and you get a great deal of stone throwing and things are broken and so on. And I investigated a case of this kind for 2 years and saw much of the phenomena myself. And it changed my paradigm. While I was there, I thought it could not possibly be explained by normal means. I got in the car, halfway home, I thought, this is rubbish, this is nonsense. You don't get things thrown around like that. But as I investigated that case and went further and further and deeper into it, I gradually became convinced that it was genuine. I even observed phenomena when I was in the building on my own, so there was no question of trickery of any kind. So by the time I got to Scole, I'd also had sittings with other physical groups and so on. So I was pretty sure that if we could eliminate normal explanations, such as fraud, for example, then the phenomena would probably be genuine, because one could not mistake what we saw. We saw coloured lights, we saw materializations, we had direct voices, that is, spirit voices talking from the air, apparently. We were touched by the spirits. We saw a whole range of phenomena which could not be mistaken by 3 investigators such as ourselves. We saw materializations and dematerializations. We saw hands materialize just up to the wrist, silhouetted in the very bright lights which the spirits, let's call them that for want of a better term, brought with them. And on one occasion, we were asked to put a Pyrex bowl on the table in the seance room to place one of the crystals in the bowl. We did this as investigators. One of the small lights then appeared to go into the crystal and illuminate it brightly from within. We were told to put our hands in the Pyrex bowl and feel how solid the crystal was. We did this. We were then told to take our hands out, feel the crystal again. It still was visually there, but in fact our fingers went right through it. We were told it had dematerialized. We were then told to take our hands out and then replace them, and the crystal was again solid. Now, it sounds, of course, as if some trickery was involved, but since our hands were over the bowl all this time, there was no way in which the crystal could have been taken out and substituted or anything of that kind. I know that there are devices, trick devices, which apparently levitate objects. We know the whole range of these phenomena. Skeptics are often unaware of the amount of experience and the amount of knowledge that goes into investigations of this kind. Between the 3 investigators, you could say we'd had 50 years and more of experiences of this kind. We know all the tricks, and in fact we had a conjurer, a member of the Inner Magic Circle, as one of the people who sat with this group, James Webster, and his opinion, his professional opinion, was that there was no way in which any conjurer could have duplicated the phenomena that we saw there. In addition, of course, we were able to search the room thoroughly beforehand, search the room thoroughly afterwards, and so on. It's very important to have a magician at these investigations, because although scientists know the science and they know the tricks, they don't actually do the tricks themselves. You need a magician there who's done the tricks, who knows the circumstances under which he can get results, and the circumstances which would prevent him from getting results. Now, we were very fortunate. James Webster, who's a silver medal holder of the Inner Magic Circle, which is the main group of magicians in Britain, had sittings with the Scole Group, and in his professional opinion, there was no way in which any magician could duplicate the effects that he saw there, even if they were given access to the room beforehand and were able to bring in all their own equipment and so on. Spirit lights are one of the most interesting phenomena at physical circles of that kind. And they generally take three forms. You have very small lights which dart around the room at great speed and cannot be duplicated by LEDs being swung round on long threads or anything of that nature, or carbon fibres or what have you. Then there are larger lights which do similar things but are the size of, let's say, marbles, quite large marbles. And then there are diffused patches of light which would be very, very difficult to explained by normal means. You can project a light onto a wall, but you can't project it readily in the air and float around and at our invitation come towards us or move away from us. And those diffuse patches of light would sometimes materialize into hooded forms, robed figures on the table in front of us a few inches away. We were even allowed to invite them to come very close to us, and then they would go up to the ceiling and then they would disappear. On other occasions, the diffuse patches of light would take the form just of a human face, moving round the room with the direct voice very, very faintly coming from the diffused patch of light and the lips moving again very faintly. In the case of Scole, we had quite an unusual example of matter through matter, in that the small lights would sometimes hit the table with an audible sound and then appear instantaneously underneath the table. Now, this was a fraud-proof table, which means that it was blocked underneath the table. So nobody could get under the table, crawl around under the table. The two mediums, nobody could get under the table and do this. And the light would materialize again near the legs, let's say, of Monty Keane, one of my fellow investigators, Arthur Ellison, or myself, in areas which were inaccessible to the mediums or the other two members of the Scole Group. The lights also had another rather strange trick up their sleeve, if I may talk about lights as having sleeves, and that was to pass through bodies, so that the light would strike the body and next moment would exit from the body. Now, I, of course, because I'm always up for these things, I invited it to come and try this on me. I wanted to see what would happen. The light hit me, and I didn't feel a thing. The light disappeared. And next moment, from inside the palm of my hand, I felt slight pressure from inside, just like the pressure that the light exerted if it landed on the outside of my palm. And next moment, the light had exited from my body. Again, these things are so extraordinary that when one tells them to people who've not had the experiences themselves, they think, oh, it must be trickery. And the challenge then always is, okay, you duplicate it. We threw out the challenge, we've maintained it throughout. We will give every assistance to any magician who wishes to come and duplicate those phenomena under those conditions, in the presence of investigators and in the presence of James Webster, who actually saw the genuine phenomena. Now, these were great experiences, you see. Again, I must stress, it changes your paradigm. You go in thinking none of this can be true, but after experience after experience after experience, it gradually dawns on you, hey, there's something going on here that we can't explain by normal scientific laws, but which nevertheless exists. And of course, it links in very strongly with survival, again, because we were told in all these sittings with the Scole Group and with the other groups that I've sat with, that it was, I don't like the term, it was the spirits who were doing this. And of course they were communicating through the mediums. We were able to hold conversations with the mediums. We were able to request certain kinds of phenomena, and they actually would produce it to order. The experiences that I've had have convinced me that it is very difficult to explain any of these things by an alternative explanation to that of survival. And of course, when you're working with mediums, good mediums, and there are a lot that aren't very good, you have to search pretty hard to find a good medium. Many of them very well-meaning, but they're not that good. When you work with a good medium, these are professional people who are actually channeling supposedly discarnate spirits. Now, they know far more about it in a sense than investigators like myself who are just sitting there observing what is going on. Now, I could go in with all sorts of grandiose theories of my own and try and tell mediums that the experiences that they have are not what they think they are. But there is grave dangers in that, just as there are in the rest of psychology. You try to dictate to people and say that you know their experiences better than they know them themselves. So, from the point of view of mediums, the answer to the question is clear. Survival is a fact, and people are communicating. Now, when they can communicate information which is not in the mind of the sitter, so there's no question of telepathy from the mind of the sitter, going to the mind of the medium and being given back to you as an apparent spirit, and when you can rule out the fact that other people somewhere in the world might know the information that you're given, then it does sound very, very much as if it comes from the discarnate person who claims to be communicating. It's the simplest explanation in many ways, and science on the whole likes the explanation that fits the facts best and that is simplest. Now, you can demolish the theory, if you like, by saying, I don't believe in survival anyway, but then that's a closed mind. and scientists should not have closed minds. We should go into all these things with an open mind, which means we look at the evidence and then we try to draw certain conclusions or form certain hypotheses on the basis of the evidence. Conditions in the afterlife, as we understand them, again through communications, through ITC communications, through medium, are that the lower levels of the afterlife are very much like this world, but that they are, in a sense, a world of thought. Just as we know that we are co-creators of this world from the atomic flux, which is the real nature, if you like, of material reality in this world. So in the next world, the mind of the observer, the consciousness of the observer, helps to create the experience. So at the lower levels of the next world, it does seem as if it is very much like this world. Either this world is a copy of the next world, or the next world is a copy of this world. But of course, we're always told that there are various different levels of the next world, and that eventually one moves into an area which is a formless area, that you go beyond form, you go beyond physical form, and exist as some form of pure consciousness. Actually, it all sounds rather like fun, which is not a bad thing.